from the graduate school, especially the professional development team, as well as all our presenters, in bringing you cutting edge information about how to be successful in the teaching environment. Now, as I think we're all aware, teaching is really a cornerstone of a university, and teaching well and being able to convey information is not only important for you within, the role that you're playing as a teaching assistant, but in virtually any job you'll take in the future, teaching, although it may not be called that, is going to be a critical component of what you're doing. And so the lessons learned here, and I think, with all teachers, the best ones are always learning how to do it better. So it's not like you can do it one time and be done with it. So people are always trying to improve and to think about how they can convey, especially complex information, in a way that is very useful to the people who they're interacting with. So I just want to welcome you all again to this online TA training. We have a lot of great speakers both this morning and this afternoon, and I really encourage you to take advantage of all of the sessions. And before we get started, I know that Vanessa has a few housekeeping items that she wants to go over.
Thank you so much, Peter, and thank you all for being here. I am the person who sends you all the emails. Sometimes they look like spam because they come from Whova, but if you get lost during the day, or if you need to refer back to the agenda, you can find all of that on Whova, either through the site or through the app if you've downloaded the app. We also have the agenda linked on our page for the new TA workshop through the graduate school. So if you get lost, a backup is to go to our Go link, which is go.ncsu.edu/TAW, and I'm also putting that in the chat. If you need to ask us a question during the event, you can go ahead and ask in the chat and I will answer, or my colleague Stella will answer, or else you can go into the community feature on Whova and go to the Ask Organizers Anything, and we'll also be answering questions there. So if you get lost, reach out to one of us. Email is going to be challenging this morning because we're expecting over 500 people, but Whova or the chat are going to be reliable ways to communicate with us. And the link again, Jacob, I did put it up a couple of messages above yours. It's go.ncsu.edu/TAW. And so if you get lost, go there or go to Whova and you'll get right back on track. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for that, Vanessa. And at this point, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Bethany Smith. Bethany Smith works in what's known as Delta, which, if you want the whole title, is Digital Education and Learning Technology Applications. I mean, I've got to say, going through a pandemic and having a group like Delta on campus with the experience that they had with online learning even before we entered this was hugely beneficial. And Bethany is a master at really thinking about how to work in an online environment and really make that successful. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Bethany Smith, the Associate Director of Instructional Technology and Training in Delta here at NC State. So take it away, Bethany.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Vanessa. I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you about active learning and some of the strategies that you can use as teaching assistants in the hybrid and online classroom. So as Peter mentioned, I'm the Associate Director of Instructional Training here at Delta. So I handle all of the professional development to use any of our academic teaching tools. I was also in the College of Education for about 16 years, and I taught myself undergraduate classes. So I've definitely walked that walk and had TAs work for me and graduate students that have gone on to do amazing things. So I'm excited to share some of these resources with you today. So our goals today, we're going to look at what is active learning, how do we define that? We're going to look at how do we apply active learning to the online and hybrid classroom, and then we're going to look at some tools that support active learning as well. So We've all been a lot in Zoom lately, but just in case, some of you might have been in Microsoft Teams, or you might have been in Cisco or some other things. I just want to go ahead and orient you a little bit to Zoom. So you will have this, you've got your mic unmuted, video. You can click on the participants list. You'll also have an opportunity to open up the chat. And then there's always some cool reactions that you could do. Some of you have already found the chat, which is great. We'll use some of those resources today as well. Oh, wrong direction. All right, so if you are teaching this fall, what mode will you be using? So I'm going to go ahead and open up a poll. I'm going to launch this first question real quick. Ooh, we've got a really good question. What's the difference between blended and hybrid? Welcome to official definitions versus definitions of what people have done, and some of those different things. So traditional blended is what we've done on our campus a lot, which is, say, for instance, we've got a calculus class that used to have 300 students in it. And now what it does is, instead of meeting Monday, Wednesday, Friday, it only meets on Fridays. And on Monday and Wednesday, they're doing stuff outside of class. And then hybrid is a lot of what we're dealing with right now in terms of the concept of students might be live streaming and watching some of that content at home while you're also teaching in the classroom. Sometimes people use those terms interchangeably, but when I think about traditional blended, I really think about the ways that we've done it in a non-pandemic setting on purpose for pedagogical reasons, rather than the things that we've done because it's an emergency kind of response. All right. So we're getting people to kind of answer those. I'm just going to give you just a few more minutes. It looks like we've got the range of everything, which is pretty much what we expect, right? So we've got some people that are going to be very traditional, some people that are going to be all face-to-face, some people are like, I have no idea. You might get a syllabus next week on Wednesday and be told what you're teaching. Some of you might be teaching your own classes already. And some of you are like not teaching yet, and you're just getting ready to be able to support or maybe grade in a different class. So I'm going to go ahead and end this poll because I think we've got some good resources, and I'm going to go ahead and share these results. So you can kind of see that we are really all over the place, which is very typical of our institution, right? That we have everybody that teaches in all sorts of different ways. And so we're going to be I'm going to make sure that I cover everything that we kind of do and kind of what those options are, so that we can kind of see what's going to happen. And then I'm going to show you, and then we're going to kind of go through some of the different tools that I asked about. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing that. All right. So how do you define active learning? So we talked a little bit about hybrid. We talked a little bit about those things, but what do you think about active learning? What does that mean to you? So if you could go ahead and in the chat, put in how you would define active learning. All right, so we've got some great things coming in here. So hands-on activities, not just lecture, active engagement, interactive through media, engaging in a dialogue with students instead of a monologue. I like that, monologue. I'm going to call lectures monologues from now on. I think that's going to work out perfect. Students take control of their education. That could be really, that's powerful. Actively paying attention and being involved. Movement and energy, inquiry and curiosity, participation. These are all fantastic things. I love the answers that you've put in here. I'm totally going to have to save this chat later. So when we look at how active learning is defined academically, it's anything that involves students in doing things and thinking about the things that they are doing, right? So it's pretty broad. Bonwell in 1991 has a really great beginning book, a seminal work on active learning and creating excitement in the classroom. And it's really that concept that a lot of you have mentioned, is that it's not just lecture, it's doing something else. And it's having your students engage in that learning process, and thinking about some of the different ways that we can help students to engage in that learning process. So let's look a little bit about what is active learning to really us. So we've got this academic definition. So it's all about students. So it's very student-centered. It's having them actively engage in that learning process. And it's not really using technology to deliver that content, but to facilitate knowledge building and interaction, right? So it's not just me lecturing to you the whole time. It's me asking a question and asking you to put it in chat. It's me doing a poll, right? It's having these little engagements so that you are actively thinking about what it is that I'm talking about in this process. So when we think about course design, what we're not thinking about is the traditional 50-minute lecture and then a 50-minute activity, right? What we're thinking of is, how do we break those things up into smaller bites? If you're presenting like this, we always talk about every 10 to 12 minutes, you should have some sort of activity that your students do, whether it's a poll or engaging in the chat or doing a breakout room. If it's in a course online, it's having small videos, right? So it's not having these huge 2-hour lecture videos, it's having short chunked videos. And then having them do something with that knowledge so that they can look at that as a way of building their knowledge in the course. And so it's really about this actively engaging rather than just passively absorbing it like osmosis in some way, like thinking that that will work, because that doesn't really work for everybody. So when you're thinking about what tools do I use to help facilitate this, you really want to think about, do the tools in my course really engage the learners, or are they passively absorbing? And do the tools facilitate interactions with the instructor, course materials, and other learners? A lot of times in course design, we think about student-to-student interaction, student-to-instructor interaction, and student-to-content interaction. And how do I make all of those interactions be as active as possible? So we're going to start talking a little bit about some tools that could possibly help us to be able to do those things. And so I'm going to first start with some content tools, and looking at some of the content tools that exist out there, that we have in Moodle. So when you're thinking about delivering content to your students, there's a couple different ways that we can think about that. One is delivering content through what we call a Moodle book. We have an NCSU book on our campus, which is part of Moodle. And that would allow you to put a bunch of content in your course, to be able to put in, we've got some professors that use that instead of a textbook, actually, right? Being able to put that content with a variety of different things in it. It could be you're creating your own video in Panopto. So maybe you're making a lecture video, maybe you're making a presentation video, or you could be using LinkedIn Learning. What you may not know is that we have access to entire LinkedIn Learning, which used to be lynda.com content, which has everything from how to be a better teacher to how do I do this SolidWorks thing, right? We actually have our most popular video on it is Excel and pivot tables, right? Like, and I'm like, yes, I need that video constantly to remember how to do pivot tables in Excel, which are awesome, by the way. They're kind of amazing. So you've got these different things of content that you can pull in and do what you want. Then we kind of think about, okay, so how do I know that they actually did the things that I asked them to do in the content? What are some of those different things? And so we think of formative assessments. Now, formative assessments are assessments for learning, right? They're not summative assessments, which are assessments of learning, right? So summative assessments are like that big exam at the end of the year. Formative assessments are data that can help provide the student with, oh, this is something I need to look at. I'm not really good at this part. Or it helps you as an instructor be able to see, oh, there are certain things that they weren't able to do. So we've got a couple different formative assessment tools, like maybe a quiz, right? So if you showed students a video and you asked them to watch that video, or you asked them to do this reading, you might give them a Moodle quiz before they came into class, right when they come into class, to make sure that you know what it is that they know and what they don't know, right? And so thinking of that as a way to actively engage your students, rather than having just one big midterm exam, finding out that all of your students missed this one concept at the beginning of the year, and now you've lost a month, right? Like keeping those smaller kinds of assessments in there. Now we have some tools that have content and assessment in them together, so you wouldn't have to separate them out. We have some really great tools like PlayPosit, H5P, and Moodle Lesson. And those are really awesome because PlayPosit will allow you to be able to basically put a layer on a YouTube video, on a Panopto video, and ask questions. I really like it because, sometimes students will put a video up and then go make dinner, right? But if you have PlayPosit, the questions that you're asking in the video, you're actually asking them while they're watching it. H5P has some really great quick interactives, drag and drop, plug and play, some really fun things that you can do. And then Moodle Lesson it basically combines book or a page, like content, and a quiz, right? And they have to kind of go through, progress through some of those different things. So do you have any experience with those tools? I kind of asked a little bit, so I'm going to share those results again. So it was really cool to see some of the tools. So some of you, Moodle Book, making videos. I'm so excited that 55% of you have been making videos before. I'm really interested in, we just finished our pilot of Panopto and officially launched. And it's such an easier tool than what we had previously. So I'm excited to use that to make videos. I'm going to have students make videos. Looks like a lot of you have used LinkedIn Learning and Moodle Quiz. PlayPosit a little bit, nobody H5P. So I'm definitely able to introduce you to the world of H5P and Moodle Lesson. So I'm going to stop sharing that. Yes, H5P is amazing. It's an open source tool, which is really nice. And it allows for you to do some of those little things without everything having to be a quiz. So it allows you to kind of do that formative assessment without it all being multiple choice. So we're going to talk a little bit about Moodle Book. So it's the static organized content. Materials, they're in these pages, and you can kind of go through these pages of all of the content that you have. You'll find that Moodle Quiz, which is can be paired with a book. So you might say, read this book, then go ahead and do this quiz. It's got a lot of different features. This is an example of one that was done in a calculus class where they actually answered the program with a file, right? So it doesn't have to just be multiple choice. It can be all sorts of different things that you need it to be. PlayPosit, it's really allowing for that interactivity of Moodle, of content. And we create things called bulbs, right? Which I love it. They're thinking of bulbs as in tulip bulbs, right? The growth that can happen through them, as well as bulbs as the light bulb. I understand this a little bit more. And you create bulbs that students can go through. So here's an example of one. This is if you haven't watched Hank Green's Crash Course, you always should, because he's kind of amazing. But here's just a little example of what a bulb could kind of look like. I got to meet Hank Green like 2 years ago, and it was kind of amazing. So there's no real audio on this, but I do want to show you. So this is an instructor kind of she added an instructor video front of the video of the YouTube. Students are actually able to click on different things and questions to move them through the video. Do you feel ready to move on to the advanced parts of photosynthesis? Then it can jump to different things. Oh, I met Hank Green and John Green. I just need to say I met them both together. They came to Raleigh. It was amazing. I'll show a picture later. And so you can kind of see that. Sorry to get off track, Vanessa. But if you kind of see how this video, what's a really nice thing about it is that it helps students just watch that video, and then now they're going to have to go through the process of actually going through and answering those questions that go through that, so that they can kind of remember the way that this goes on. And so it can be a really great way to help your students go through that process. H5P is a great little content authoring tool. We've got a couple different options that we'll be able to, let me copy this link address and I'll put it in the chat. And these are really neat ways that you'll be able to kind of see how to go through. So for example, I have a faculty member, Christine Cranford, in our English department. And she uses H5P as ways to kind of review some of the different documentation. So the video, so I think the thing that's important to realize about PlayPosit, I'll go back real quick, is that this video, the only thing the instructor had to make was the questions on top of that video. That video they grabbed off YouTube because it was just a really good video. So they didn't have to make the video at all. All they had to do was add in, so if I play this, so these, they just had to add in the questions so that their students could use it. So right here, there was a question about where are stomata located, and then students had to answer that question. So what's really awesome is that you don't have to spend all of your time creating all of this big content. You could look at what content exists out there that you could use. But that was a really great question. Oh yeah. Yeah, PlayPosit's been used in high school like for the last like 10, 12 years. Like it's kind of amazing. Thank you, Katie. So H5P is nice because it's this really great way of getting your students to interact with maybe some other content that you have. So for instance, in this example, oh, went too far. She has some content that she's given her students, and then she's asking them to be able to check true and false. Zia asked a great question. Can you take any content from YouTube? What about copyrights? So the way that YouTube copyright works is that if you were to use that content in a way that it was not intended, right? Or if you were to like manipulate that content, you are totally allowed, as long as that YouTube content is public, to be able to use that public content in your course, as long as you're not selling it, right? So like if there's some different things in that, but I can use it for educational purposes. And I'm also able to add that layer on top of it through PlayPosit legally. Do you guys have a copyright session? I don't know if you have a copyright session coming up, but we have a fantastic lawyer on our campus that's actually a librarian that gives some really great sessions about fair use and copyright that I would definitely recommend you look at. All right, back to H5P. So H5P is really great because I can just do some quick checks. So I'm giving some content, and then think of it as like I've created like a PowerPoint slide, and then I want to ask a question and then give a new slide. And then LinkedIn Learning, we talked a little bit about this, but there are some really great curated videos that you can get through lynda.com. And And what's really great about that is that that could be, so sometimes YouTube, you're like, Hank Green crash course, amazing. But there could be some other content on there. You're like, I'm not so sure about that. LinkedIn Learning content is curated and they're really nicely made videos. And if you're going to be teaching, like I have a professor I work with in agricultural economics that basically like my students need to know this about Excel before they can do this stuff in my class. So she's able to say, everybody take this Excel course in LinkedIn Learning. Make sure you know all of these basics so I don't have to teach that to them. And we can get on with the content that I need to do in my class. So it can be really, really great. And we would encourage you to balance videos and activities, right? So making sure, so this is an example from a class that's looking at, all right, a computer science class, I think. So basically students have this opportunity to be able to, they do a self-check. They're doing some pre-lab thinking. So they're doing an activity form, then they're watching a video. You'll notice that they've mentioned how long that video is. So students can kind of navigate, think about how much time they need to spend. Then they have to complete a quiz. Then they have to watch 2 more videos, then complete a quiz. So you can kind of see that there's this process that they're going through. So instead of giving 1 quiz at the end of watching a 1-hour video, they're giving short videos with quizzes that are specific to that topic. And then they're doing a before and after pre-assessment and post-assessment to make sure students have learned what it is that you wanted them to learn, so that students are engaging with that content and you understand what your students know and what they don't know. So we talked to, I'm going to share those results again, right? So that third question was really looking at some of the other tools that we have. So Zoom, 97%, we've Zoomed a lot this year. Top Hat, Google Docs, Moodle, and Panopto. Glad to see so many of you have used Moodle, probably more as a student than as an instructor, but it's always good, I think, for everyone to have that student experience to kind of see what that looks like. So let's look at some of those different tools and what that could look like in some active learning classrooms. So there's different tools when we think of some synchronous tools and strategies, right? So we've got Zoom, we've got Top Hat, we've got Google Docs, we've got Moodle forums. So with Zoom, we really recommend that you kind of look at what are some of those different breakout rooms that you could do. What are some different ways that you could use breakout rooms? We've seen breakout rooms used really well, and we've seen breakout rooms used really kind of horribly, right? Like if you just send students to a breakout room and you say, hey, I just want you to, I just want you to go ahead and talk amongst yourselves, they're never going to do that. Right? That's just never going to happen. Some of the things that you're going to have to do with breakout rooms is you're going to have to you're going to have to give them specific things that they're going to have to work on. So maybe it's a case study. Maybe you're doing a think, pair, share. Maybe it is a discussion and you've got questions somewhere. We've seen people use some of the tools in the Google Suite, such as Google Docs, Jamboard, to be able to pull some different things up. So you can kind of really think about what are the different things that you want to do in your course, and how do you get students to have those discussions well. And I think that becomes really, really pivotal as we go through. So then we've got Moodle forums, and I do say somebody brought up a really great question. If I go to the Q&A, what are some useful ways to frame discussion questions? So I've got a specific answer to that I'm going to do at the end. But I'm going to come back to this, and Moodle forums are great because and I've found that I've actually used Moodle forums even when I'm not teaching online or hybrid, because I want a lot of times I ask a question in class, one student answers it, they answered correctly, and we move on, right? And normally the person that answered that question is in the first 2 rows, right? Like they're excited to be there, they're doing all these things, and I'm not reaching the person at the back of the room. And so what's nice about Moodle forums is that I could say, all right, I could ask this question, ask everybody to post their answer to the forum, and then I can see that everybody's kind of on the same track. And then I could pick randomly some person in the group and say, okay, can you share your answer? Rather than the person that's really excited about it. And it can be also a great way to get people that need some time to process. They need some time to think about what their answer is. They don't like being on the spot, to be able to contemplate that. I've worked with classes that have 300 students in them. And so using groups can be a great way. So it's not just one forum for the 300 students. You've got 5 students in a group, right? You've got, just small groups of students to be able to do these things. And then one of the things that we've been dealing with a lot on this campus and preparing for this year is looking at Panopto and our live webcast feature, right? So what if you have students that have to stay home, right? And they're having to quarantine. What are some of the different options that you have? One of the things that we talk about is making sure you have a lot of your activities already in Moodle. But how do you keep them active, right? Like if they're just if your students can just watch a live webcast, why would they show up to class? Right? I think that's always a really good thing to think about when it comes to active learning, right? Like what is the benefit that you're giving them in class? If you're doing active learning, they're getting that benefit because they're engaging with you and with the content. And so there's a couple of different things that you can kind of do with Panopto. Panopto is our classroom recording system that we have on campus. But as part of the recording, there's also an option to live webcast. And some of the different things that we could be able to use might end up being Moodle chat and hot question. It could end up being Google Slides and Q&A. It could be Google Docs. It could be Padlet, or it could even be discussions in Top Hat. So there's some really fascinating things that you could be able to do that kind of end up in these things. So, going back and forth. So when I look at these and I look at some of these options, I'm thinking of what are some of the things that I feel comfortable with, and how do I get my students to kind of answer those questions? And so is it through something as basic as a chat where I want students to back channel chat? Is it something like Google Slides where I want to be able to answer questions? So questions come up, I want to be able to answer them. Is it something like Google Docs where I'm asking them to take notes and do different things? Or am I doing something like Top Hat, which is the ability to ask poll questions, to be able to ask discussion questions and basically push those all out to my students as we go through? The important thing is finding the right tool that fits with how you teach and the way that your students are learning that content, right? Like there are certain things that I might use based on the content that I'm teaching, and there are certain things that I might use based on the size of the class that I'm working with. For instance, I work with somebody that teaches a physiology class, and she loves using Top Hat and being able to use Top Hat because she can annotate on it, show different things, and then be able to push that to students and ask them to do annotation as well. Whereas when I taught, I really enjoyed using Padlet because it was very anonymous and I could ask questions and students could come up with things, and it could work out really well for my class. And I had a small class of 25 students, right? And it worked out well that way. All of these tools we have workshops on, right? So what I'm trying to do right now is kind of excite you into some of the different things that you could do, what's out there, and know that all of the tools and all of the workshops that we teach for faculty are for faculty and instructors, which means that graduate students are always welcome to come to all of them because you're instructors, you're teaching. And we want you to be able to use those as best as we can. And we also find that when graduate students use the technology well, they might end up helping their faculty members use that technology well. So we get to make sure that that goes up and travels up. So I get really excited about that. So I wanted to leave, so we've got some active learning resources that I've got on these slides. Yes, I'll be sharing these slides with everybody. But I did want to go ahead. We did have a question that came up from Katie about what are some useful ways to frame discussion questions to help get the class to lean in and engage. And that is an absolutely fantastic question. I teach a 2-hour workshop on it. So we're going to do like a quick little thing on it. But the first thing that I want to say is that Discussion boards have a really bad rap. And as we can see, it's a lot of 2 + 2 + 4. Wow, Jim, I totally agree. I like how you added the twos together and got a 4. Very insightful, right? Like these are the things that happen because we ask really bad discussion forum questions. We're asking questions to see whether or not students understand something. We're asking a formative assessment question. That is not discussion. That is a quiz question. Right. And when we force people to have these really bad discussion questions, they hate discussion boards. Like they do. So how do we change that? It's my mission in life. So the first thing is, so there's something called Bloom's taxonomy. If you're unfamiliar with it, as a teacher, I highly recommend that you just Google Bloom's taxonomy. It will help you write learning objectives to figure out what the words are that you want students to actually do. And when you're thinking of discussion questions, you really want to think of this part of the discussion question process. I don't want students to define something. I don't want them to identify or explain something. What I want them to do is maybe compare and contrast. Maybe we want them to defend or argue. We want to ask them questions that solicit discussion. Right? So maybe we ask questions that ask them some relevant personal opinion or a personal experience. You as students know that you bring a wealth of knowledge to the table and a wealth of experience. Why don't we ask about that? Why is the introduction forum where people share about themselves the best part of a forum or the best forum we have in a class? How can we have every forum be that way? Maybe asking really specific questions. I really love this question. Like, all right, so if we're looking, imagine you're an administrator at this university and you're having to have an outside of a formal list of speech codes, what would foster a university atmosphere receptive and welcoming a difference? So your first response should outline the measures you want to take. And then your second response should evaluate the pros and cons of somebody from another class. So it's really important on a discussion forum to have students understand what are the ways that they are allowed to critique or respond to somebody else. Because otherwise they're going to be like, that was a really great job. I agree, right? They're not going to want to push back, but you've told them they have to. They have to in this instance. And that's really important and that's powerful. And I think that's powerful even if you're doing a discussion in class where students where you're having them critique each other's work or give feedback, you're making them do those things. Another one that I found that I really like. So this is an article reading. So many times we ask students read an article and then answer this question in the discussion forum. Well, all right, so you've got so this is it, right? You're writing a critical evaluation, explaining your points using examples, but I love this part 2 part. Find 2 sources that support your evaluation and give a summary of both. And then why did you use those sources? That's a really great example of making students do a little bit more with that article and then also possibly building up that article for other people to look at. We also have the opportunity in Moodle to use something called a Q&A forum, which means that students can't see other people's posts until they've posted. So then they're not all using the same articles and not seeing that together. So there's an opportunity to kind of do more. And there's a lot of other sorts of different ways that we can kind of look at this idea of some discussion questions, framing discussion questions. I will also add that there is something called the jigsaw method, which I didn't put in here, but it's one of my favorite active learning strategies, or one of my favorite discussion strategies that really allows for every person to be an expert. It takes a little while to kind of set up, but it can be a nice way to make sure that everybody contributes to a discussion. So I think I've got 5 minutes left, right, Vanessa? Right? Yep. So what other questions do you have about active learning or some of the tools that we have on campus that could help facilitate that? Go ahead and put those in the chat so we can see what those are.
Bethany, can I also ask if you could tell us how to register for Delta workshops?
Ooh, yes. So just like you did go.ncsu.gradworkshops, it's go.ncsu.edu /Delta workshops. And we offer a variety of workshops, both online and in person. Any other questions? Come on. I know you guys got some questions. Oh, Katie's got a question. Great. Are these tools feel a little flooded? Is there a cheat sheet?
Yeah, I posted it in the chat. This is so amazing. I'm learning so much, and most of these tools are new to me, and I'm going to be a first-time instructor. So for me to make sense of them all and be able to sort of pick which tool will be most useful in which session of my class, I was wondering if there is a cheat sheet list of tools that are maybe organized by function or challenge as a teacher that you're facing that would answer that dilemma.
So we've got a couple different answers for you. So one, we've got our list of instructional tools here that kind of goes through all of the different tools that we have available on our campus and what are some of the different things that they do. We also have our a new teaching resources website. And part of what that goes to is a lot more of the pedagogical aspect and then what tools might meet that need, right? So if you're like, I'd really like to work on my communication, what are some different things that I can do in communication? So here are some different things that you can do with communication. And maybe it's doing real-time assessments and check-ins. And so this is kind of going through some of those different things. What are the process to do that? And then what are the tools that would help facilitate that? For lower level classes, how is the best way to move up? You're going to have to define move up to me. Levels of understanding. Yes, very good. So we're talking about and let me go back to that Bloom's taxonomy. And just like Vanessa said, there's some really good things. So you might, with some of your foundation courses, you might be more in the remember and understand aspects of it. But we always talk about, so I'm going to go a little academic. So there's this idea of cognitive load theory and this idea of stretch, right? Like we need to have our students like stretch a little bit to be able to learn. And a lot of times learning has to be uncomfortable in order for that to happen, right? Like it has to be something they don't know and they have to kind of go in to be able to do. So even if you're teaching some of these different things, really, there's always going to be an opportunity for them to kind of maybe go up just a little bit, right? So maybe you've given them the foundation and they've done some things. Well, now, they're going to have to implement something. They're going to have to compare and contrast something. So they're going to take that basic knowledge and do some more complex things with it. That's how I would kind of push them up. Lenore asked, when I was in a problem session, it was common for students not to participate in groups. How do we avoid this? So there's a couple different ways. And we do offer a workshop on groups and group work. But the main thing is, do you want to hold students accountable? Or do you want people just to be able to kick students out of the group, right? Like, what is your philosophy on how you do this? I used to always I used to give a group grade and an individual grade. And I used to always use Google Tools so that I could see which students contributed what to be able to give them that individual grade. And I let students know that I was doing that so they just all didn't sit around one student to be able to do those things. And then the last question that we have today, the department uses PackBack. I actually have very conflicted feelings about PackBack. I actually kind of don't like it. Sorry. And I haven't seen any good research come out that shows how it works well. And I've seen way too many students figure out how to get the AI to give them better grades. However, I've seen a lot of faculty that are using it because they have super huge, large classes. And I think that is something that it can help them with and be able to do those things. So I'm a little, not all tools are created equal, and it really is what it is that you're trying to do and what it is you're trying to accomplish. So I think I'm done. So I'm going to go ahead and stop. And I've got just those different resources that we have. You can always request a consultation and do different things.
Thank you so much, Bethany. As always, I learned something, and I've got my Linda Excel pivot table video queued up for this afternoon, because I always forget how to do them. It's one of those things that you do once and then you don't do it for a while, and then you kind of need to go back to ground zero. But thanks again for really a super informative overview, and it kind of blows me away in terms of all the things that are available to us as instructors right on this campus. So thanks for doing that overview. At this point, I'd like to pivot to our next speaker, April Kedrovich, who's an associate professor with a specialty in communication. And interestingly enough, she's not in the communication department, but she's actually in the College of Vet Med in the Department of Clinical Sciences, which I think mirrors what I was talking about earlier, that communication and teaching is always important, and it's done in a variety of different environments. So without further ado, let me turn it over to April, who's going to be talking about competent communication in the classroom, building relationships for student success. And thanks again to you, Bethany, and thanks, April. And I look forward to hearing the next talk.
Thank you so much, Peter. Thank you, Vanessa. Just want to make sure, do a quick check. Slides are looking okay. Everyone can hear me okay. Excellent. Well, I really appreciated your presentation, Bethany. I appreciated also your introduction, Peter, to really how important it is to acknowledge that what teaching looks like, right, is not necessarily just what we think of in terms of teaching in the classroom, right? We can teach in a variety of contexts, and we're always learning how to be better teachers. And so what I'm going to talk about today really spans knowledge that I've generated through teaching through a variety of contexts and teaching for about 25 years. I just noticed that I don't have my video on, so let me go ahead and do that. Perfect. So yeah, all the things I'm going to talk about today really are a reflection of the fact that I've been teaching for about 25 years in some capacity, and I'm always improving my teaching. So I still love to go to faculty workshops on teaching. I like to be a part of conversations and journal clubs that are related to teaching. So just a little bit about my background before we sort of get into this, because it will help inform my conversation with you today. So I have been teaching for 25 years. I have a background in communication. I have taught communication majors, both at the undergraduate and graduate level. I've also taught non-communication majors. So my career really has spanned preparing future professionals for the communication demands of their work. So to that end, I have taught communication, professional communication to engineering students at both the undergraduate and graduate level. I have taught communication to business students. I've taught communication to executive leaders. I've also now most recently been teaching communication in the College of Veterinary Medicine to our Doctor of Veterinary Medicine students, as well as to our graduate students in our Comparative Biomedical Sciences program. So I have taught students sort of in this smaller forum, right, where it might be a lab situation or small group conversations with students. I've taught students, around the realm of about 30 in a class. Most of my communication classes were those smaller size classes. I've also done one-on-one coaching and training with students. So some of you might find yourselves in this role. And I have taught rooms that look like this, right? So anywhere from 1 to 300 students. But what I've learned is that regardless of the number of students and regardless of the discipline in which I am working, really the key is building relationships. So everything I talk about today is about building really good relationships with your students. If you do this, it's going to enhance your credibility. It's going to help you build trust with your students, and you're going to be better able to engage your students. So when I say build relationships, really, what does that mean? So there are 4 principles that underlie understanding what it means to build good relationships. So one is an acknowledgement that every single person is unique. So all of your students are unique. They're going to come with their own experiences, with their own background, right? With their own values. All of that is going to inform how they receive the content that you're delivering, and how they build relationships with you. It's also important that we communicate authentically. I think sometimes when we step into professional roles, like role of teacher, we sometimes have this view that we need to remain very detached. We need to communicate in one way with everyone. It's really important that we communicate authentically and that we meet each student where they are. It's also important to remember that emotions are central to all of our experiences. It would be probably a lot less complex if we all lived in a world where we were able to be logical and rational all the time, but we know that that's not the case, right? So recognize the power of emotions to the student experience. And then most importantly, learn from your students. And I think I heard Bethany mention this, or maybe Peter mentioned this in the beginning, right? Anytime you're developing a relationship with someone, that relationship is reciprocal. So your students are going to be learning from you, and they will change as a result of that education. You also will learn things from your students. At the end of the day, it's really important that you begin every session with an intention to help your students learn, to want to engage them, to communicate clearly with them, and to foster good critical thinking. So how do we build these relationships that are built on trust and openness? Communication is the key, and that's what we're going to spend our time talking about today. You need to create an environment where your students feel safe. This is crucial. They need to feel safe to ask questions. They need to feel safe to take risks as they're learning, right? We heard Bethany talk about how we need students to go outside their comfort zone. That is true of your communication as well. If we create this safe environment where we're building good relationships, they're going to feel safe to do that. They'll feel safe to try and engage in some problem solving. And they'll feel safe, most importantly, to fail and be willing to try again. So it's really important that we trust as educators in students and their desire to learn, and they can trust that we as teachers have a desire for them to learn and grow. And the way we do that is, a nice way to remember this is through the 3 E's. So this is the thrust of the communication skills that I'm going to talk about today, is really an ability to empathize with students, to engage them, and to be enthusiastic. So let's jump into our first E, which is empathy. Empathy really means that you are able to engage in perspective taking. You are able to acknowledge your students' experiences for what they are, right? The most highly skilled communicators are those who can express empathy. So this is one of the things I hit regardless of the context. If I'm providing good training on how to be a competent communicator, at the core, I come down to the ability to empathize, right? Perspective taking, stand in their shoes, see what they're seeing. So if you can excel at identifying with what your students are thinking, with their feelings, right? Maybe with some of their anxieties that they have, this is going to be key for you as an educator. This might sound a little bit abstract, so let's talk about what this actually looks like in the classroom in practice. It means that you begin with your students. So you may have content that you're really passionate about. You may have information about your discipline that you get really excited about that you want to share. You might have a deep level of knowledge, and your passion is communicating that knowledge to your students. And that's great. You need to be passionate and you need to have that deep level of knowledge. But at the core, to teach effectively, it's about beginning with your students, not with what you know, not with the discipline, not with the content that you've been asked to teach. So there are some ways that we can do this. If we're going to truly empathize with our students in the classroom, we're going to begin with them. What does that look like in practice? Here are some things to consider, right? What are your students' motivation? What's their existing knowledge, right? What might be their prior experiences that they're bringing into the classroom? What are their values? What might be some of their anxieties about the course, about the content? So motivation, right? Why are they attending? I mentioned to you at the beginning that I've taught communication primarily now for the last 20 years to non-communication students. So you can imagine that sometimes the motivation to learn my content, if I'm teaching to an engineering student, for example, might not be as high as if I'm teaching to a communication student. So is this, for example, a core course in the student's major where the level of motivation to learn might be really intrinsically high? Or are you teaching an introductory required course, right, to students who aren't going to major in your particular discipline? Are you teaching introductory math students, for example, right, or biology students who aren't going to major in that? That's what I mean about motivation. So why are they attending? Is it a requirement? Are they checking a box? Or is it something that truly they are interested in because it's a part of what they want to do in the future? Makes a difference in how you reach those students. What's their existing knowledge level? So this can be the knowledge they might be bringing with them straight out of high school. It might also be if you are teaching a course that is not entry level, it could be what are the things students have already learned before they walked into my classroom, and how can I build on that knowledge that they already bring with them? And it might also be something like considering their anxieties. So is this a class that has, for example, a reputation for being really difficult and challenging? Might students have anxieties around the content? So that's what I mean by empathizing and beginning with your students. So consider their motivation, their knowledge, their experiences, and their anxieties. Another more practical way that we can express empathy in the classroom and reach our students is by considering things like just very logistical things like the time of day that we're teaching, where we're teaching, and maybe other demands that our students are currently grappling with, right? So for example, I am very much a morning person. I would much rather teach at 8 o'clock in the morning than have a 4 o'clock class. My energy levels are higher. That's where I feel comfortable, right? But I recognize that for my students, it could be different. So the strategies I'm going to use to try to really engage my students are going to be dependent upon the time of day that I'm teaching, right? After lunch might also not be the best time slot. We know that our energy levels might dip. So we might have to work a little bit harder to engage our students to keep their attention. Also consider the setup of the room, right? So when you are going to be in front of a classroom, that's going to look really different if it's 100 or 200 students looking at you versus if it's a smaller classroom or even, a seminar type space where you might all be sitting around the table. So consider those things because you're going to have to work harder to really try and engage your students dependent upon sort of room setup. Are you doing it over Zoom, right? We heard Bethany talk about really great ways to utilize functionality within Zoom to also try to engage our students in meaningful ways. So consider that. And then also, what other demands do your students have currently going on in their lives? It would be wonderful if all students had to do was take one class, yours, right, or mine, and that's where they could dedicate all their attention. But we know that students are spread really thin, right? They're taking lots of classes. They have different schedules. It might be a heavy exam week, for example. And so acknowledging that. And one way I actually do this with my own students is I know when my students are having pretty high stakes exams in their anatomy class, for example, and I'm teaching them team communication or client communication, right? So I can always tell just by sort of looking out at my students if it's a particularly heavy week for them. They're antsy, right? They might look a little bit more tired. They're just not engaging with me. I'll actually stop at the beginning of class and check in with them, right? How are we feeling this week? I know you have an anatomy practical coming up this afternoon. So if you can work with me for the next 50 minutes, we're going to work really hard on this particular content. And then you can focus all your attention on the practical that you have coming up this afternoon. So I just sort of voice it. I put it out there that I acknowledge that they're dealing with other things. And I try to be empathetic in that way. I also try to take some time at the beginning of every class to have short conversations with my students, just check in. How are things going, right? Have you taken some time to for yourself this week to try and relax? Did you do anything fun over the weekend? Those are little ways that you can build rapport, trust, and that facilitates the development of that good relationship. It's really crucial that you communicate empathy during each interaction, right? So when we think of empathy, we might, at a cognitive level, right, understand where our students are coming from. We might even understand what our students are feeling, stressed about the fact that they have a bunch of midterms coming up, for example. As I mentioned, talking about it though, the saying, the acknowledging that I understand what you're going through, by verbalizing that with your students really goes a long way. So some other ways that you can communicate empathy during each interaction beyond sort of acknowledging what's coming up for them, right? Their experiences and challenges, is to share similar experiences that you might have had, right? Letting students know that, yeah, I also struggled with this content. And particularly for graduate students, right? You're really close to that undergraduate student experience. So empathizing with the fact that I might have also struggled with this content, right? Or I know what it's like to have exams. I'm also going through that. Feel free to share that, to disclose that with your students. Offer to help them, provide advice to them, particularly if they come to you and want to seek that out. And most important, be ready to listen to them, right? Give them a space to communicate their questions, their concerns, right? Their worries about what might be happening in their course. And then, because empathy isn't always about, right, things that might be challenging for our students, praise and congratulate them. So if you've asked students to complete an assignment and they really hit it out of the park, walk into class and tell them how proud you are of the fact that they did such great work. That also counts as empathy. Any questions about empathy before we move on to our second E, which is engaging students? All right, let's talk about how to engage students from the beginning of your class to the end. So this is a good news, bad news scenario here, right? So students recall 70%, that's a lot, 70% of what is said in the first 10 minutes of a class. They're there, they're eager, right? Their attention level is high, they're motivated. In those first 10 minutes, they remember 70% of what is said in those first 10 minutes. In the last 10 minutes, estimates range about 20%, right? So from the first 10 minutes to the last 10 minutes of your class, the recall is going down. So it's really important for you as a teacher to get your students' attention and keep it. And the way that you do that is by actively engaging them. And Bethany provided some really good information on how to do that. I was really happy to see her say, you know, about every 10 minutes, we need to do something. And I'm going to reinforce that in a couple of slides. The other thing to recognize is that even the most motivated people will remember, 20% of what they hear, even when they're highly, highly motivated. And that's because it can be really a struggle to listen. Now, there are things you can do to increase that retention, and students who are taking notes, for example, are likely to increase their retention, but do recognize that it's a struggle to really listen. And for some of you, you might experience some of these barriers to listening. So these are some of the common ones. So up here in this box, this is what's known as pseudo listening, right? So these are people who know that there are particular ways that I can demonstrate that I'm listening, right? By looking very interested and thoughtful, by nodding my head. Maybe, I've got a pen and I'm jotting some things down. Nobody knows what that really is, right? These are people who perform listening, but are not actually authentically listening. And sometimes this happens with the best of intentions. We might start out really engaged in listening, and then over time, perhaps because of lack of enthusiasm from our presenter, or maybe because we're just not super interested in that content, we're still able to sort of show non-verbally that we're trying to listen, but we're not listening as actively as we should be. So that's pseudo listening. We also get sidetracked, right? We are human, and all of us have other things going on, and it's really easy for us to get sidetracked. This is true, especially, it's true across contexts, but especially when we are teaching in a virtual format with Zoom, right? There is the temptation there to exit that full screen once your presenter has put up their slides, and to open another window and to start focusing on other things. So in order to minimize that, right, I would encourage you to have a conversation. Again, this is a way to empathize with your students. Acknowledge that there's that temptation, and then ask them to resist that temptation, because really being focused on what you are communicating in that virtual format is going to help them retain that information. Then we have the silent arguer, right? So this is a person who might be listening, but might be ready to challenge, right? Or react. So forming a response in their head, as opposed to really listening completely and thoroughly to what you as the teacher are communicating with them. And then finally, and I alluded to this a little bit, this is especially true again in that virtual world, right? We can focus on irrelevancies and distractions. So it might be opening a new window if it's in the classroom, right? Sometimes what I see happening is, people checking phones, looking down. So really encouraging your students to put those distractions aside. And I always share with my students the fact that there is some research that has come out recently about cell phones in particular that says, even if your cell phone is turned off, but it is right next to you and you can see it, mentally you're distracted by it. So I encourage my students who really struggle to listen to put their phones in their backpack, put their backpack right on the floor next to them so that they don't see it. And it's something there's no temptation there whatsoever. Because again, we're human. And especially since we've been dealing, primarily with virtual meetings and instruction over the past year and a half, there is that temptation to get pretty distracted. Something else to consider about engaging your students, right? And this becomes challenging the larger your class, because if you've got 200 students, it can be difficult to know how to engage all 200 of those students. But really what it comes down to in terms of engaging your students throughout a class session is the relevance of the information that you're providing to them. So think of this as, right, how does this affect me? This impacts attention and retention because people are more likely to listen and to remember something if it relates to my needs, right? Or my wants, what I want to learn, or how this information that you're teaching me is going to be a benefit to me. Now, sometimes this can be a challenge. So as I mentioned, if you are teaching an introductory course and maybe none of those students are going to wind up majoring in your particular discipline, it can become more challenging to sort of show them the utility of that information. But there's always a way to show utility, right? Even if they're not going to focus on that. So for my discipline, what I teach communication, I can always find ways to make someone who is not focused on my discipline understand that communication is relevant to them, right? Even if I have to say at a basic level, what I'm going to teach you is going to be relevant in your personal lives, right? Even if it goes beyond that, I find a way to make it relevant. So consider that. Perhaps it's that this is going to be a building block for another course. Perhaps it's that this information is going to make you more well-rounded, more knowledgeable. Perhaps it's that, okay, for some students, it might be, it's really important that you are engaged, and I as a teacher am going to do everything I can to keep you engaged so that you can earn a good grade in this class, right? Students are extrinsically grade motivated. I'm just looking at the chat. So I want to pause here for a minute. I've observed undergrads roll their eyes when people in authority talk about digital distractions. Yeah, I mean, I don't belabor it too much. And honestly, if they want to roll their eyes at me, I'm okay with that. But I do want them to understand that here's what the research shows. So if you want to be able to retain this information so that you don't have to go back and spend, hours and hours and hours studying it, if you focus really hard in this hour that we have together, right, or hour and 20 minutes, you're going to have to spend less time studying because you've been really focused. So that might be one strategy that you can use, right? I think this goes along with the argument that we hear students sometimes make, which is, I'm a really good multitasker. And we know what the research shows is that none of us are good multitaskers, and that really multitasking is not a thing. What we are doing is task switching. And every time we switch from focusing on the information our instructor is providing us to checking our email or our Facebook or something else, or looking at notes for another class, we're not only missing that information, but it's going to take us that much longer to get caught up once we switch back to that original task at hand. And so I'm pretty transparent with students and share that and try to communicate to them that it's in their best interest to not engage in task switching and in distractions. It can be really helpful. Another way to sort of make connections for students or to engage students and show the utility is to be really clear and transparent about how each session builds on the other, right? So starting at the beginning by reviewing where you've been, introducing the topic for the day, and showing how that fits together. So providing those good roadmaps can be helpful. Because students are being subjected to an immense amount of content throughout all of their courses in any given semester, this is a really powerful move to sort of center them on your course for the next hour that they're going to be with you. Another way to make sure that we keep their attention with us for the duration is to build in effective redundancy. So this is true if it's a 50-minute session, if it's a 2-hour session, it's really important to build in redundancy for our students. So I want to ask you to, in the chat, when I say build in redundancy to your session for your learners, what might be some ways that you could do this? Okay, good. I'm seeing class agenda, reinforcing questions and discussions, repetition, absolutely. Repeat things in different ways for different styles of learning, all excellent ways to build in. Yes, summary slides, really great way to build in redundancy. Repeat a concept whenever you come back to it, incorporate essential questions. Yep, rephrase it. Excellent, you guys have this, right? So there are multiple ways that you can build in redundancy into your class. So just some additional very basic things to think about is that the visuals that you use. So if you're using PowerPoint slides, for example, that's a natural way to build in redundancy. So you are communicating something verbally to your students, and you're also having a visual there that sort of reinforces whatever it is that you're talking about. Including good periodic summaries is another way to do that. Having a good preview at the beginning of your class session is another way to do that. Repeating things periodically, which was something someone else mentioned. And again, good summaries. So a nice way to think about this, really concise way to build in redundancy to your teaching is tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them, right? So a preview at the beginning, that might also make those connections to previous courses. Breaking your lesson or the concepts that you're teaching into 3 or 4 discrete chunks of information that you're going to cover. Clearly stating those again when you get to them. Providing a summary of each chunk before you move on to the next, and then providing a summary again at the end of the key 3 or 4 concepts that you talked about. All really effective ways to build in redundancy. Because again, remember, if we're struggling, if our attention is starting to sort of decrease over time, redundancy is a way to sort of bring it back. So this is where I'm going to reinforce what Bethany mentioned about the 10 minutes, right? So about every 10 minutes, our attention is going to start to wane. So even if we're very motivated, at about the 10-minute mark is where I might be tempted to, right, check my phone, open up a new window, maybe look at something else, even if I'm in the classroom. So about every 10 minutes, short attention breaks are helpful. So what might be some things you could do every 10 minutes? You want to take a 2-minute break every 10 minutes? I mean, that might not be feasible, especially if you're in a 50-minute class. So what other things could you do? Okay, I'm seeing ask questions. Excellent, work through a practice question with your students. Some sort of related activity. Yep, pair share breakout, really excellent. Okay, I think we've kind of stalled there. Those are all excellent strategies to use to give an attention break every 10 minutes. So sometimes, yeah, you could crack a joke. Humor is really important. So remember, I said emotions are central. Humor, right? That will increase affect for students, right? If you build in humor, and humor, provided, right, it's appropriate humor, that will help students to actually remember. So it's sort of doing a couple of things, right? It's bringing them back around, but it's also further helping them remember the information that you're communicating to them. So if you're in a longer class, you certainly could give an actual break, right? So sometimes when I'm teaching a 2-hour block, I will give students 10 to 15 minutes in between. And that's, we just sort of decompress for 10 to 15 minutes. If you're in a shorter class, even if it's an hour, you might give a 3-minute break, right? Or you might ask students to stand up, sort of stretch if they've been sitting a lot. You can do something interactive. So I saw in the chat, a lot of people were saying that some sort of related activity. So do something interactive. Ask a question was something that was brought up. You could do one of those periodic reviews, right? So we've been talking for a few minutes now. Let's review what we've talked about. You can also use your nonverbal communication to break it up. So this is if you are face-to-face, and particularly if you're in a rather large room. So if you're teaching to 100 or so students, you could start at one side of the room, provide your instruction for 10 minutes, and then move over to the other side of the room. And it's just something as simple as the motion you're creating from one side to the other that sort of attracts students' attention. So it breaks it up. And that's a very subtle thing that you could do. You could also tell a story of some kind that relates to the material, right? Or share some sort of a narrative, put a narrative structure around the content that you're teaching. So all of these are really great examples of things you can do every 10 minutes. Now you might be thinking, well, does it really matter if I share a story that somehow relates to what I'm teaching? I share a story to kind of make the abstract concepts really concrete for students. I put it in a narrative form. We actually have research that does suggest, in fact, stories do make a difference for our students. It helps with increased recall on exams. It fosters learning of more detail, right? So remember, if we're already struggling to remember good chunks of information, sharing a story of some kind that's relevant to the material helps us recall additional details. It also, again, because I think it taps into our emotions a little bit, results in enhanced positive affect toward the instructor, right? So that means students are going to like you more. They're going to view you as more approachable. And it helps them to sustain their attention. So if you can find ways to build stories or narratives into your teaching, this is a powerful way to help keep attention and enhance recall of content. And then remember, I said, as we go through our time with our students, that attention starts to dip off. So if the last 10 minutes, we remember only about 20%, we want to make sure that we're maximizing that last 10 minutes. We don't want to just say, well, we're running out, right? We're getting rushed. I'm running out of time. That's all I have, right? Or we're going to just stop here. Or really quickly when time is expiring, any questions, right? While the next instructor is coming in, trying to get ready for the next class and the other students are waiting outside. That's not an effective use of the last 10 minutes of our time together. So obviously you can summarize. The goal is really to leave a strong impression with your students, right? You want to make sure you're maximizing that. So what are some things you could do at the end of class, right? 10 minutes. Summarizing is good, but can you think of specific ways that you might do this? An exit ticket, okay. Oh, ask them to recall or recap, yes. So instead of you summarizing for the students, ask your students, right? We've talked about these 3 things today. Can anyone give me one, right? And you have one student provide that information. Another student provides another piece of information. So it's about students. Yeah, you could give them a pop quiz, right? So I've prepared 5 questions related to the content from today. That's going to help you know what you might need to review or emphasize in the next class session. It's also going to help the students understand maybe what they really need to focus on when they're studying on their own. Yep, previewing the next class. That's really crucial. So this is what we talked about today. Next time, here's where we're going. Absolutely, Katie. Students are going to remember what they said more than what they heard you say. So having them provide those takeaways is really important. So anything you can do to sort of reinforce, leave an impression, get them thinking, a game of sort to test knowledge, right? Maybe asking them, what's one thing that you didn't know before we had class today that you found most interesting or intriguing? It can be things like that, but some way to get them thinking, talking, typing, whatever the case may be, to sort of leave that impression. All right, we are on our third E. Hi, I'm enthusiastic, right? So it's important to empathize with our students, to start with where they are and to think about their experiences and to tailor our instruction to them. It's also important that we think very purposefully about how we can engage our students from the beginning of the class to the end, from the beginning of the semester to the end. It's also important that we bring our enthusiasm and passion into the classroom. So there's a lot of research that suggests that one of the most important factors for students' attention and learning is the enthusiasm of the instructor. And so hopefully the content that you're teaching, you are excited about, right? You do have an interest in it. You're passionate about your discipline and about that content. So here are some ways you can communicate that enthusiasm in the classroom with your students. One of the most powerful ways, right, is through really connecting with them, right? Or creating a sense of immediacy with your students. And this, I know, can be harder when we're doing it over Zoom, but there are still ways to do that, right? Camera on, really be focusing, looking at where your students are so that they can see you sort of looking, even if they might not have cameras on. But when you're face-to-face, especially, really making a concerted effort to connect with your students through making good eye contact with all of them. Not only is this fostering, again, that sense of immediacy and connection with your students, but it also lets you get feedback from them, which is really important for you as an educator to be able to make those important shifts in the moment. If, for example, you're seeing a lot of students are really confused, right? They might be conveying to you non-verbally that they're confused by what you've just said. So then you can read that, pause, ask, right? How is this landing with you? What questions do you have? I get the sense that we're moving a little bit quickly. So getting that feedback is really crucial, again, through your eye contact. You can likewise see if, hopefully you're not going to see this too frequently, but you can see if you've sort of lost your students, right? If they seem like they're completely disengaged, that's a clue to you that maybe you've been talking at them for too long and it's time to do something more interactive, engage them in an activity, ask them a question, right? Take a quick 3-minute break. The other way that you can show your enthusiasm, so eye contact is really key. You're going to connect, you're going to get feedback from them, is through your delivery. So be mindful of your vocal delivery and adapt it depending upon the context of your teaching. So for example, if you are in a very large lecture hall, hopefully you will be mic'd up so that everybody can hear you, but it's really important that students can hear you. There's nothing more frustrating than students not being able to hear. They're not going to retain information if they can't hear what you're saying. So making sure that you're projecting your voice, particularly if you know that you're a more soft-spoken person, or maybe when you get a little bit anxious, and when you're teaching, you're going to get a little bit anxious, that you have a tendency to be quieter. Considering the rate at which you speak. So research suggests that in general, people who speak faster are viewed as more competent and credible. And we also know that the brain can process something like 400 words a minute. And most speakers are speaking somewhere around 100 words a minute, right? So there's room for you to express your enthusiasm by speaking, at a good clip. However, you don't want to race through information, particularly when it's complex material. That's where you're going to want to really make sure that you make a concerted effort to slow down your rate of speech. Incorporate good pauses periodically. If you're asking students a question, pause, count to 5 really slowly, give students a chance to think, because we know that it's going to take a moment for them to process what you've communicated and also formulate a good question or a response to the question that you've asked them. You've probably all been in a situation where you had a presenter who was speaking in a monotone. We want to minimize that. So making it sound very conversational is a way to use your vocal delivery to show your enthusiasm and your confidence with that material. Also be mindful of vocal segregates or those filler words like so we all have them and we use them in normal conversation, and a certain amount of them will make it feel more conversational. What we want to make sure that we're avoiding are too many inappropriate pauses or vocal fillers that make us as a teacher seem like we lack confidence in what we're communicating. And then finally, be mindful of physical delivery. So again, if we were face-to-face and we were in a really large room, I would have been running all over that room, right? Because that's my style, and I want to make sure that I'm engaging with all parts of the room. So if you feel comfortable not being tethered to a desk at the front of the room, I would encourage you to move. If a student asks a question, move toward that student. Repeat the question they've asked and then answer it for everyone in the room. Again, that's a way non-verbally for you to show enthusiasm and to create that immediacy. You also want to make sure that you're not being too distracting, right? So know what happens to you when you have some nervous energy or anxiety, and keep your movement and your gestures purposeful and without distraction for your students. Also consider sort of your posture, right? If you stand tall with confidence, if you're dressed professionally, all those things can enhance your own confidence and competence as an educator. And again, show your comfort level with the students and your desire to show that enthusiasm and keep them engaged. So at the end of the day, building relationships with your students is the most important thing, and communication is really the key to get there. And so today we talked about 3 specific aspects of communication, the 3 E's that you can utilize in your teaching to help develop those really good relationships with your students. So in the chat, can you give me the 3 E's that we talked about today? Excellent. Empathy, engagement, enthusiasm. So the other prompts that I have here are not things that we'll necessarily talk about, but this is another example of how at the end, you can leave your students, your learners, with questions that are going to be thought-provoking for them. So what surprised you? What will you implement? What do you want to learn more about? So these are things that you can think about as you're transitioning from this session into the next session. And thank you so much for your engagement with the chat. Thank you so much for having me today. It's been my pleasure to share, some tidbit of the wisdom I've gained over the 25 years that I've been teaching.
Thank you so much, April. That was, as always, very informative, and I think incredibly important for people to think about in terms of engaging with their students. Our next session, we're going to move to an issue that I think is really critical, and something that in many cases we as instructors don't know exactly how to deal with. And that really revolves around, to a certain degree, to put it briefly, the mental health of our students and how we deal with issues when they arise. Thankfully, we have with us today Angel Bowers, who is the director of our prevention services. And she's going to talk about today supporting students in uncertain times. And certainly we are in uncertain times right now. So thank you so much, Angel, for being part of this, and take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Harries. I appreciate that. And Vanessa, I realize I uploaded things this morning, so I'm not sure if I need to share screen or how that works right now, but
Angel, if you could share your screen, that would be ideal.
perfect.
Thank you so
Perfect,
much.
Perfect. Yes, absolutely. I mean, as a clinician, I will say I'm like not the most tech savvy person, but I feel like I'm getting better every day. Like it's the new normal is definitely putting me in a place of learning more and more technology. So it'll take me 2 seconds here. Okay. Oop, sorry. So real quick, while I'm doing this, the first thing I was going to start with, and you all can do this while I am clicking and clicking, is I want you to take some deep breaths right now. So I start every session, I start every outreach with mindfulness and with connecting with our bodies and grounding ourselves. So that is a great way that we can multitask here. So if you all can take a moment just to close your eyes if you're in a place where you can do that. If you feel safe, you feel comfortable, take a few deep breaths, allow yourself to get more grounded. Think about your environment. If you need to take a drink of water, if you need to make a large movement, I'm a big fan of like large movements because those are the things that help us kind of wake up and transition as well. So you all do that, take your moment, take your deep breaths, and I will have this up in just a second. Okay. We'll take one more really deep breath because it feels so good. Be loud and big about it. Excellent. Excellent. And then we'll come back to center. So hello, everybody. I am Angel Bowers. I am the Director of Prevention Service, as Dr. Harries mentioned. I have been a very proud member of the Wolfpack family now for, I guess it's been 16 years. And I'm pretty recently moved over to Prevention Services, which is a newer program in the Department of Academic and Student Affairs. And it really fits with my passion around prevention education and connecting with students on the front end before things become a crisis, before things become a concern that's more difficult to navigate. And so I am thrilled to be here with you all today to discuss how we can help you learn some of the resources to share with your students to help them navigate through in their process of adjusting to the university, as you all are going to be adjusting to your new positions as well. I always tell individuals that the information I'm sharing with you obviously is so that you can be more supportive of the students, but it's also for you too. So all of the resources that I'm sharing, you will have access to as a student also. So please keep that in mind for yourself. I will do my absolute best to answer questions in the chat as they come in, and please feel free to send me questions my way. You can also email me anytime. I'm a quick email answerer as well, and I'll drop my email in the chat also. So we're going to segue beautifully, I think, from the last presentation, which I always learn a lot from that presentation. So I always try to join early so I can hear, into this question of how are we supporting the whole student. And what we know about our Department of Academic and Student Affairs is that we do promote the success of the whole student. So we obviously want our students to be scholars and academics, and we want them to learn and grow and develop. But it is every bit as important that they learn and grow and develop as a person, that they feel more connected to their identity, that they feel that their lived experience is honored, that they feel safe and that they feel protected in the academic environment, and that they feel that they have resources that they can connect with on campus, and you all will be one of those resources. So often I will have faculty, TAs, postdocs say to me, but I teach physics or I teach math. Like, I'm not a therapy person. I'm not a warm fuzzy, even sometimes I'll hear. But at the end of the day, what we know is that students do look up to you all. They do trust you all, and you are more likely to hear about things from students before someone in the counseling center, before someone in prevention services. And so while I am certainly not asking anyone to be a junior therapist or to offer therapy or ongoing support in that way, it is very, very important that you are aware of what the resources are, so that when a student comes to you and shares that they've had a loss in their family or that they are experiencing mental health challenges, that's something that we can help them navigate on our side, and then we can help communicate through you if needed. So I'm going to talk to you about a couple different ways that we do that today, but I also just want to highlight our department for a moment. So when we look at DASA, and again, this is for students, but it's also for you all. We have a really robust arts and culture program. So we have Arts NC State. We have a craft center that is absolutely brilliant and one of the best stress relievers on campus. We have a museum and a theater, and then we also have NC State Live. So it's really important to think about, like, how do we think outside the box, and how can we talk to students about support and resources that don't fall into a therapy office or a doctor's office, because we know that for many students, connecting is going to come in other places like this, like through the arts and through culture. And so we want to know about those resources as well. We also have a really strong student life program. So we have student media. Obviously, we have housing. I think I heard yesterday that I believe it's 8,200 students are moving on to campus in the next 3 days, which I have to say that makes me sweat a little bit. But it's a big number, and that actually doesn't even include the Greek life housing. But we're obviously going to see just a huge rush of people on campus, particularly over the next couple of days. We also have a student conduct office, which I believe you'll learn more about that and how that relates to your role if needed. And then PAC Essentials, which is without question my favorite resource on campus, which offers support for students who are experiencing housing insecurity, food insecurity, or also are in need of clothing for interviews or other needs that they may have. And so this is just a resource that has exploded for us on campus over the past couple of years. I can't say enough about it. And just knowing that that exists for a student when they share general information for you can go a long way in really decreasing the stigma that they may feel about accessing some of those resources. We also do a lot of leadership development here at NC State. So we have a career development center, we have a leadership development program, and also we have a strong diversity program within DASA, but also outside of DASA, we do have our campus community centers, which hopefully you all will learn more about as well. But we have the African American Cultural Center, Multicultural Student Affairs, GLBT Center, Women's Center, and these are all really big pieces of the work that we do from a counseling and prevention standpoint, to make sure that we understand that students are going to seek out support where they feel most seen and most heard. And so we want to offer support in all of the spaces, and we hope that you all do that as well. We do have a really robust health and wellness program here at NC State. We have a very big student health center that I'm sitting in right now on the second floor. We offer wellness and recreation. I did a tour on Tuesday of the new updated fabulous rec center on campus, on main campus. I have never seen anything like it. It is truly stunning. And I tell folks, if you can't find it there, it probably doesn't exist. And they've also been very careful about creating safe spaces for students to exercise and to focus on their well-being, as well as spaces for individuals who don't like to work out in front of a room of like 100 other people. So it really has a little bit of everything to offer support. Disability resource offices, counseling centers I've mentioned, and then prevention services, which I'll go into more detail about the two of those. So one of the things I want to start with is putting some information out there about how our offices can work and support, and how this will help you determine the way in which you would make a referral to a student. So through the counseling center, we offer, as you can imagine, counseling, and it's pretty traditionally what you would see: clinical staff members that are providing an assessment. They will connect students with individual counseling or group counseling. In some situations, they will refer a student to off-campus counseling for those resources. So a lot of students will say, sure, I will go to the counseling center, sign me up. that's my path, and you've done a great referral. But for a very important percentage of students, that referral is not going to be as easy. So either they do not feel comfortable connecting with counseling, they are really unsure, they have questions, they're not sure if that's the right resource for them. You might meet with a student who needs multiple resources. So in addition to counseling, they also need support through disability resources. They also need support through PAC Essentials. And you're wanting to help find a more inclusive service for them to connect them with. And that's where CARES case management comes in. So this is a program through Prevention Services, or we have licensed professional staff, licensed clinicians who provide assessment of what are the connections that we can help a student with, how can we find programs for them that will be beneficial, and also we continue to follow up with students. So once we meet with a student, which I'll talk about more in a moment too, once we meet with them and we share information about resources, we also check back in, because we know that if a student is experiencing distress or they're feeling overwhelmed, that just handing them resources is not the answer. I will say this has become very real for me. I have a sophomore this year in college, and I'm all about like sending the resources or doing the click, and then I'll follow up a week later and say, hey, and he's just like, Mom, stop. Like, I did not call them. And so I have a very realistic view of how often students will follow up. What we do know is this, that if students receive information multiple times, usually about 2 to 3 times, they are more likely to follow up with the resources. So that is why we as CARES case managers reach out to students at least 3 times when we're trying to make a connect with them. Sometimes we won't hear back from a student, and other times it'll be 6 months down the road and we'll hear back from a student. And they'll say, hey, I remember you reached out to me about resources. Can we find a time to meet? So the way that would look for you is to kind of think about, like, what are some of the things that come to mind when you think about what you would refer a student for, if you will. So essentially anything that you feel falls into the camp of mental health, anything that you feel falls into the camp of multiple resources, or if you feel like a student is struggling just to make those initial first steps, they're saying, I really want to go to counseling, or I really want to check in with this, or I really want to go to multicultural student affairs, but I just need the push to get there. That is where we can become a very helpful resource for students. And we are a very highly utilized resource for students. This past year, we saw over 1,500 referrals come in for students. This number has definitely gone up, 115% increase over the last 3 years. And certainly, as you all could imagine, we see more referrals for our first and second year students. And the most common things that we see are academic and financial stress, which financial is very interesting because that's become much more of an issue over the past 2 or 3 years. Before, it wasn't even in our top 10, but it is something that we see more often now. Also, I just got some data the other day that I need to update this, that reports of family stress were very, very intense this year, which is not a surprise considering so many of our students were at home. We also had students who were providing childcare for siblings. We have individuals who are navigating, as I'm sure many of you in this space are navigating, the demands of family or responsibilities and work and school and other things, and really having to balance in a way that we've not seen before. And all of those things are true for our students. So we know that this has just been a very difficult and challenging time for many, many of our students, for many of you as well. And so we have focused on really increasing our resource availability, our staff, to be able to connect with students. And then unfortunately, and very sadly, we do see an increase in the number of concerns of students reporting suicidal ideation. So this has been up 10% for us, with our number of attempts up 20% over the past 2 years. And so this is something that we want to pay very close attention to. If there's any concern of risk that a student ever shares with you, you certainly want to follow up with that immediately. And sometimes folks will say, well, I don't remember which place I'm supposed to call. I assure you, if you get to any of us, we will get you to the right place. So typically the best route is to refer directly to us in CARES. If you call the counseling center, they're probably going to say this is best to make a CARES referral. So everyone refers. People will say, should I? Do I do this? What about HIPAA? What about FERPA? What about some of those things? It is important for you all to know that in your role that you can share information with us about a student from a need to know basis. So if you are concerned about a student, behavior, academics, other concerns, that is information that you can share with us through part of this report, the concerning behavior report. So I have staff say, well, what should I put in this? Or, faculty will say, what can I share? We strongly encourage you to put everything in this report that you know. And now sometimes folks aren't as comfortable with that and they'll say, I'd rather do this by phone, or I'd rather share some more vague information, but that information will actually become part of that record as well. And I don't say that to dissuade anyone from sharing information. It's just important that we have the most updated information that we can about what's going on with a student. So sometimes folks will say, well, I know that someone else in the department already referred this student. And I would say that while that is wonderful, we want to make sure that we put referrals in as they come up. So just because you know a student's been referred doesn't necessarily mean that that student has followed up with us. It doesn't necessarily mean that we know the specifics of what you are sharing about a student. And it's also important for you to know that when we reach out to a student, we are not saying, I'm reaching out to you right now because Dr. Peter Harris sent in a referral about you. We do not share with the student where the referral comes from. And the reason for that is because it can cause damage in relationships. It can impact trust, but mostly we're just trying to do a general outreach to students. So we are reaching out to them when they are connected. I'll actually go to this next piece. Oh, I'll come back to this. We're reaching out to students in those moments and we are offering them a resource. They do not have to follow up with us. They're not in trouble if they don't follow up with us. And we usually will just make a warm outreach to say, hey, are there some concerns going on right now that you would appreciate support with? What I do find fascinating, which may not surprise others, but a lot of times we'll reach out and say, hey, are there some concerns and help? And they'll reach back out and say, yes. And it's something that was completely different from what was referred. And so I think it just is a nice open door to students to connect them to these resources as well. We do like to set a divide between counseling and prevention just from the standpoint of students understanding that we are not connected to the counseling center. We refer a lot, but not necessarily connected. So students, it's important for them to understand that we will be doing risk assessments. We will be looking into things, but we are not counseling. So a lot of times students will come to us and say, well, I thought I could kind of do everything in one place. But we are just a resource hub for the students. So as I mentioned before, CARES is covered under FERPA. So we are not part of counseling. So we are not part of HIPAA. So the good news about that from our standpoint is that we can reach out to you as the referrer and say, hey, can you tell me some more information about this? We also can reach out to you as the referrer and say, it's been about 4 weeks and I haven't heard from this student. Do you have any updated information about this student? And so you are likely, if you make referrals, to get those kind of emails from us. You're also likely to get those kind of emails even if you haven't made a referral. So if you are concerned about if someone else in another department has the student who's also in your class and they make a referral, if we can't get in touch with the student and we're concerned about a student, we will reach out for collateral information about a student. So those would only come from case managers in our department, and that would be highlighted in our email. And it would also have information there about information that you can share as well. And at any time, if you have any question about this, you can always consult with the faculty member that you are paired with for your TA role or your supervisor. Definitely don't want you to feel like you don't have a choice or you can't get questions answered in that way. But it's also important to understand our motivation and understanding that we are not making referrals to student conduct. So if you send a message saying, hey, I think this student might be under the influence of drugs, and I'm really worried about them, that does not then become a student conduct case. Historically, it did up until about 3 years ago. And so that is a big, very, very important shift that we want you all to know that you do have a safe place to send students for that support, where they're not then going to get in trouble or then have negative impact from the referral that you make, because I know that really kept a lot of people from referring in the past, and we don't want that to be a barrier any longer. So I walked through this just a little bit, but I just kind of want to do this just a touch more, just to share some of the things so that you can understand this process. So when you go to the Prevention Services website, as I had listed before, you're going to see a big red button on the page, and you click on that button and it will send you to this referral resource for the students. So once the referrals come in, so let's say, a lot of times I will be doing a presentation like this, and when I finish the presentation, I'll have a couple referrals in my inbox because folks are like, oh yeah, there's that student, I need to check in with them. And those referrals will come directly to me. So there's a team of us that get the referrals in real time. And then once we see them, we will review that information, and then we'll decide if it's a CARES case, which is my department, or if it's a BAT case, which is more of a behavioral assessment team. That's more when there's risk to the community or risk to other individuals, which is fairly rare, but you can definitely make those referrals to the same place. So once that referral is made, like I said, we will refer this, and then we will reach out to the student. So as I mentioned before, we send kind of a standard outreach, check in with the students, offer to meet with them. If the student responds, we'll set up a time to meet, and then we will also then create a follow-up plan. So as mentioned here, as I mentioned before too, we will assess for suicidality and homicidality, as well as self-harm, substance use concerns. So we'll do what appears to be kind of a clinical interview with a student so that we can get to some of those concerns and get them connected to the resources that they need. And then following that, if a student does not reach out, as I mentioned before, we are persistent but kind. So we will reach out again to a student. And then we will reach out a third time, and we will do email, we do text, we do phone, because we know students are pretty notorious for not checking their emails. And so we want to be able to connect with them in any way that we possibly can. When there is risk, this is our one caveat to the we're not sharing information, or we're not, the student is not going to have someone come up to their door for a welfare check. If a student is sharing information about current risk, and we cannot get in touch with them, this will then become a situation where we might have to involve housing or might have to involve campus police to do a welfare check on a student. I will say that as our very last option, we will do everything we can to try to get in touch with a student. I do not enjoy sending the police to residence halls or to other places unnecessarily. And so we will do everything that we can, but definitely know that if that were to happen, that we tried every other outlet to do so. And so I put it here a couple times, and I would just say again, please contact us if you have any questions. This phone number you can use to call our front office, and you can say, hey, this might be a referral, it may not be a referral, I'm not sure. But I will say I've never seen a bad referral. So I truthfully have never seen a bad referral. So if you think it might be a referral, make the referral. I would strongly recommend it. This is our CARES button here that I mentioned before, and this really is our preferred method of contact, just because we access it 24 hours. Now, that's not to say that I'm getting up at 3 a.m. and responding to emails, because I try not to, and hope you all have those boundaries as well. But I do want to have access to it as quickly as possible so that we can offer support and resources for the student. Whereas something left on a voicemail over a weekend is just more difficult for us to get to. One thing I do want to mention as you're getting this information from students is that you are also responsible employees. And Vanessa, I know historically we talked about whether that was brought up in another session or not. And I'm not sure kind of where that landed, but I did want to put this in here just in case.
I think that's reasonable. And then Betsy will follow you and probably expand on it.
Perfect. Even ideal. So I just want to mention here some things about the counseling center, just briefly. I won't go over all of this in the interest of time. But I did get a new stat this morning from NAMI Wake County, and NAMI is the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill. And the stat came out that 64% of young adults that were previously enrolled in college stopped attending due to mental health issues. I don't know that that is surprising to everyone. I will say I've been in this field for 22 years, and it takes my breath away in those moments when I see some of those statistics. So it's just important to know that this is a very, very real concern for our students. 8 out of 10 of our students report that the things that are getting in the way, the barriers, the impediments to their academic success, they describe as mental health related. 8 out of 10. So this is very important that we are able to connect students with resources, that we're able to follow up, to be able to offer them the support that they need, particularly around some of the primary issues that we discussed before: academics, finances, stress, ongoing mental health issues, ongoing challenges that they may be experiencing. Actually, so the counseling center, as I mentioned before, this can definitely be a direct referral. So if a student says, yes, I want to go to counseling, wonderful. You can make a direct referral for them. So this is also information I'm sharing for you as well, as I mentioned, since you are students also. If you pay the student health fee, which all enrolled students do, then you are eligible for assessment and consultation at the counseling center. This could involve psychoeducational resources, outreach programs, group therapy, which is incredibly effective for college age populations, psychiatric services as well. And the newest update that I just could scream from the bell tower with joy is that we just found out that for our Student Blue, which many of our students are covered, this is not the GSSP though, this is the Student Blue insurance, that they are going to be covering telehealth, which they initially said they would not, and that they're also going to have a $10 copay for students. This is game changing in our world. So if you have students who say, I went to the counseling center and they said I need more long-term, but I don't know if I can afford it, it's not the $40 copay, the $45 copay that it used to be. A $10 copay is really going to help reduce barriers to services for many of our students. And then finally, the best thing to do as far as referring a student directly to counseling is to give them the phone number. We are a 24-hour, 7 days a week, 365 days out of the year office. So a student can call right now during regular triage hours, which is the 9 to 3, and they can get information about making an appointment. They can, once they make the appointment online, they will be sent some information, and then they will meet with a triage counselor briefly through Zoom. So at this time, all of the triage appointments and intake appointments for counseling will continue to be remote. Now, once the student meets with their therapist that they've been assigned, they will make a decision about whether or not they will continue in an online or if they will move to in-person sessions. But that will be a decision made between the individuals. But again, we have found, particularly for graduate students, that the Zoom sessions have worked really well because you all have just really intense schedules and a lot going on. So those are the general resources of the Counseling Center of Prevention Services. And like I said, some of the things from DASA in general. I think that I have 90 seconds. So if there are questions, and like I said, I can also stay on and fill some things in the chat as well, if anyone has questions as we're moving into the next section as well.
I don't want to interrupt you, Peter. I was just going to say there are a few questions in the chat if you don't mind answering them there, Angel.
Sure.
I took on what I knew, but it wasn't all of it.
I love it. I love it. Well, thank you so much, Mars. I appreciate the comment about students having good experiences. Let me see. Yay. I love the thing about the water and the we also are doing a lot of dog programs this year, just so you know, if you miss your dog, we're going to have a lot of programs this year related to that. Let me see, I'm trying to scroll here. Is it best to tell the student you are referring? Oh, this is a wonderful question. So I love the transparency and the openness of a referral. So one of the very best ways to refer a student is to sit down with them and say, hey, you've disclosed to me that you need these resources. This is a really great way. Let's sit down and do this form together, or do it through Zoom. Those just go really well. When a student knows they're going to get the email, they know they're going to get the follow-up. That's a really great way to do it. Also, you can encourage students, or yourself, you can refer yourself. And this is something we're really pushing with individuals to say, you get here and there's, 50,000 people on this campus, and Raleigh's really big, and all of these things. We can help narrow that down for students by reaching out and offering them resources as well. And then, so I'll answer Mitchell's question, and then I will move the time because I know Betsy is here and everything she has to say is phenomenally important. So Mitchell, I know that some students are worried about being reprimanded or reported for having mental health issues. How can I assure them of this? I will say, I think that exactly what Vanessa said, we have made a big shift in this. It's also something that we are happy to talk to students about as well. So we can talk them through that process, but also knowing that there is truly, truly nothing as part of the CARES process that would lead to a student being, having follow-up or punishment or student conduct concerns or other things when they're reaching out for support and resources and help. It's easier said than done, because I know sometimes we say that and students are like, yeah, right. But I think part of it is just us continuing to educate the students, remind them that we are a hub of resources and that we are looking to meet the needs of the students in the best way possible. And just reminding them that they can reach out and ask questions anytime.
Well, Angel, thank you so much for your presentation and for all that you and your group in prevention services do for the campus. I have used, as you know, your system quite a few times, and I just appreciate how professional you always are and how helpful. So thank you so much. Changing gears a little bit, our next speaker is Betsy Lanzin from the General Counsel's Office, who's going to talk about FERPA and some other legal aspects that we think are really helpful for you to be aware of. So without further ado, let me turn it over to you, Betsy, and thanks again, Angel.
Thanks, Peter. Let's see if I can figure out, do the screen sharing. Yes, stopping Angel's screen share. My video of all the rest of you guys in the meantime. Just work out my technical thing for just a moment. Hi, everybody. I'm Betsy Lanzin, and I'm an attorney in the Office of General Counsel. And I have the exciting topic of FERPA and other legal considerations for you. And I'm sorry, I normally I like to pick something that's a little bit more interesting, or at least to make this more interesting. I like to do it in person and throw candy and prizes at folks as we go along through the hypotheticals. But I'm afraid that is something that's not going to be possible today. So instead, I will try to be efficient and answer your questions in the best way that I can. And I'm sorry, I seem to have lost the chat when I went to screen sharing. It's not letting me get it back. So, all right, so I'll come back to that there at the end if we have questions along the way. But I did hear Angel speaking beforehand, and I love working with Angel. I think her department is really phenomenal, and I love working with Angel in particular. So one of the questions I think that came up during her presentation, I'll just answer off the bat because it's not on my list of things to go through today on our agenda, but is about responsible employees and mandatory reporting of Title IX things. So we have, last year, the Title IX rules changed, and so we now have two different categories. It's a little bit confusing, but we have something called designated officials, which is required under the new Title IX regulation. And so those are a list of just a few certain folks at the university that if those folks find out about a potential Title IX, they have to do something about it. And so those are designated officials that would not include teaching assistants. But then there are also responsible employees, which are folks all over campus, which we encourage to make or require them to make reporting under our own university policies, because we want folks to report things if things aren't going well, because we want to handle them and we want to take care of them when we can. And the responsible employees, if you just Google NCSU responsible employees, and I put the link in the chat earlier, should come up with a list of those categories. And teaching assistants are not included in that list. There are a number of folks within the colleges that are, but teaching assistants are not there. That doesn't mean that we wouldn't like for you to report them. It just means that you're not a mandatory reporter under our policy. And so we would encourage folks to talk to the students if they come and say, I'd like to report this. I want to be able to report this. And because it'll come up in our FERPA presentation as we go through, you have the ability to report it. But whether or not you want to work with the student to get consent first, you might want to do that, but you don't have to under FERPA, if that makes sense. So I hope that answered the questions. You're not mandatory reporting, but we encourage you to report and to talk to the student and let them know you're going to report. All right, so going back on with today's presentation, we have the exciting agenda we have for today is that we're going to talk a little bit about public records. It won't be long, I promise. It's only part of one slide. And we'll also talk about the rules about retention of records and disposition of records, because it's related. The university is part of the UNC system. So we're a public agency of the state. And so we're subject to the North Carolina Public Records Law, which means by default, anything that's sort of done in the business of the university is going to be a public record. So we'll talk about that more in a second. And then we'll talk about exceptions to the Public Records Act, which would include student education records, which are protected under a federal law called FERPA, which you may or may not yet be familiar with, but it's going to be what the bulk of our conversation today is about. So hopefully you'll be very familiar with it in about 20 minutes. and then the last, we're going to briefly touch on university interpersonal relationships, just because that's also important to what you're doing and regulation here at the university. So public records and record retentions. As I mentioned, we are a public agency of the state. And so anything that is, let's see, the definition is made or received in connection with the public business of a state agency is a public record and subject to the Public Records Act. And so unless an exception applies, the public has the ability to inspect all of those. And I can assure you, we get jillions and jillions of requests literally all the time to release certain types of records throughout the university. We have a person here at the University Records Office, or who works in the Office of General Counsel, whose full-time job is to just release records to all the people that request them here at the university. And she's quite overwhelmed because she gets so many of those requests. In fact, like at our sister school down the street, they have probably 5 or 6 or 7 people doing that. And so we have one person doing that job here. But at any rate, it would be important that if you get a records request, we would generally encourage you to funnel those up to our records officer and that let her handle it, because there are certain requirements about how you do that to be consistent with the law and all that sort of thing. So because we're obviously a public agency and most of our records could be considered public records, we have we're not allowed to destroy them by statute unless we have the consent of the Department of Cultural Resources. And so the North Carolina Department of Cultural Resources has worked with the UNC System Office to create a general records retention and disposition schedule, which I'm sure you all would love to review. It's 132 pages and has all kinds of different categories of documents. And there are all sorts of different deadlines for when you must dispose of them, or how long you must retain them. And they're sometimes overlapping and can be a little bit hard to understand. So our university records officer is a great resource for that if you have questions that come up about that. But in general, for purposes of what you all will be doing with the TAs, the categories of things that you must keep up with, or things like coursework, so tests and papers and things like that aren't returned to the student, the university has to keep them for 1 year after the course concludes. Grade reports we have to keep for 3 years. Course syllabi we have to keep for 4 years. And then class recordings are also considered, part of the records. And so they're actually kept until the recording is no longer, it's obsolete or it's been superseded. So think that's all that I was going to ask, give you guys information about on the public records and record retention. I wanted to spend more time talking about the exceptions to it, because that's something that you will come into contact with a fair amount. Some of it was coming up in Angel's presentation just a few minutes ago about what you can share. Anything that pertains to a student that is recorded here at the university is considered to be a student education record. Some of them are treatment records, but most of them are student records. And we'll talk a little bit more about exactly what that means. But under FERPA, which is the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act of 1974, students get certain rights. And so for purposes of college students, there are really three big rights that you get from that. One, you get to control the disclosure of your education records to others. Two, you get to inspect and review your own educational records. And you get to seek amendment of those education records if they're not accurate. There's sort of a complicated process to do that, but the federal statutes give you those rights. And so for purposes of what you guys are doing in your TA role would be that you should know that anything that you write about a student that has personally identifiable information in there is an education record of that student, and they might have the right to be able to see it and what those comments are, and theoretically to go through a process to seek amendment of their education records. I will tell you, we do not see that last piece about seeking amendment very often, but we do see often people will request, I want to know what happened in that class. I want to have all of the records of what the faculty member has or the professor has. Comes up in written student complaints at the end. They want to see records and do record requests, and they have the right to be able to do it under the FERPA. So let's talk a little bit more about what exactly is an education record, because it's really any kind of official record, file, or data directly related to the student. An official can be, even notes with doodles on it if it's related to, has the personally identifiable information of the student. Now, FERPA only applies to educational institutions which receive federal funding. So if you went to some other private school that didn't abide by those rules, it might be because they don't receive federal funding for some reason. But most private and public institutions do receive FERPA, federal funding, and so are subject to FERPA. It includes really anything that is recorded and directly related to the student. So it can be things that you would normally think about, academic work, test, homework, that sort of thing. But it also includes financial data that's submitted with your application or disciplinary records. It includes health data, vaccine records, all that sort of stuff. Any record of the institution that has personally identifiable information about the student is protected by FERPA for the most part. Here I've got a little picture of the green represents everything protected by FERPA, what's considered a student education record. And then there's a small subset within that although it is an education, that is a student record, it's not an education record. It's excluded from the definition. Thinking sole possession records are the exception that would be most likely applicable to you guys. So if you have notes that you take about students that come into your class, you've got a class of, let's just say 30 students, and you want to be able to talk about, you want to help yourself jog your memory about who's who in the class. You might have someone that you've written, the Sally who comes in 5 minutes late every day. That's what her name is Sally. And you might just write a note about comes in late 5 minutes every day. You might write a note about somebody else. He's the one that brings his dog to class, is emotional, or those sorts of things. And so we, any of those notes that are just for your own purposes, your own notes, and that as a memory aid are sole possession and not FERPA. But if you share them with anyone, so if you were to give them to the faculty member who's working in the class with you, then now they're an educational record. And so they are subject to, the student can inspect them and all that other sort of stuff, the rights that we were talking about a few minutes ago. There are a couple other categories that fit into those not education records, but I don't know they're particularly interesting. I mean, things like law enforcement records or our university police records are not student records unless they're shared with the university. If we were to get a copy of it, then it becomes an education record. Or treatment records by the counseling center and things like that. So records with a psychiatrist treating a student, those records are not, they're called treatment records instead of education records. So students aren't able to actually access those in all cases. There's a little bit more limited on those. They can be shared with other treatment providers for the student, but not necessarily the student. Let's see, disclosure of education records. I'm not going to spend much time on this slide other than to just say that our university records officer is the person that we've designated to handle this for university, and is where I would suggest you funnel all the request for education records, because a certain format has to be followed to make sure we're in compliance with federal law. We've got to keep logs of what we release, who we've released it to, what we released, all that sort of information. And so the purpose of this slide is just to really ask you to funnel most of those requests to the records officer. Now, there are some exceptions to FERPA where we can release student education records without their consent. I mean, most of the time when we have an education record, if you were to release it to anyone, that you would need to have this consent of the student, or some other exception would need to apply. So Angel was talking about one of those in her presentation just a little bit ago. So you might have someone from the CARES team that might reach out to you to talk about a student. If a student has been referred to them with a concerning behavior report, and the CARES team is trying to follow up and get a little bit better idea of how the student is doing, whether they're coming to class, they might call and ask you questions about it. And so the person on the CARES team is a school official with a legitimate educational interest in this. And so they do have the ability to get that information from you, and you can share that without getting consent from the student first. Same thing with our BAT team, all those sort of teams, and the Office of Student Conduct might have information in looking for a legitimate educational interest to be able to investigate a conduct issue. But if another TA for another class that's not related to your class wants to know information about Joe Smith and doesn't have an educational interest in it, you can't share it with someone, even though they're part of the NC State community. It's got to be someone that has a legitimate educational interest. Some of those things can vary by what the situation is. And so if something comes up where you have a question about that, just reach out to our office, and we're happy to answer those questions and help you walk through that. Another exception that is helpful for people to know is that under the federal law directory information, which the federal law gives each of the universities our own ability to define what a directory information is, to be able to release that information without a student's consent, unless the student is opted out of being in the directory. In the old days, directory information was easy. It was, sort of like a phone book that had the person's address and phone number where they are. Now we don't do that for safety reasons. In fact, we specifically in our directory information do not include phone numbers or physical addresses of where folks are. So you won't be able to get that information even if you are in our directory, but it does include information that you might not necessarily expect. Whether you're enrolled full-time or part-time is information that's available. The dates of your attendance here. For student athletes, their weight and height is directory information, what clubs that people are involved in. And that information, if you're interested in what is a directory information, if you just Google NCSU FERPA, our FERPA reg will come up, and it's in section 4 of that. But it has some interesting categories there. And if you want to opt out of having your directory information available, there's a way to do that, I believe, through the MyPack portal, but I'm not an expert on sort of the logistics of how you come out of it. I just know that you can opt out. So another category of information where we can release information about a student education record without the student's consent is if it's a health or safety emergency. And so the health or safety emergencies are really sort of, exactly as it says, it's needed to protect the safety of either that student or other students. And so examples that the Department of Education gives about what they consider to be an imminent emergency or something that's impending or very immediate and actual and likely to happen. Things like there's a natural disaster, a hurricane's coming, and I need to be able to tell the family to come pick up their student or something like that. Or, there's a terrorist attack or a campus shooting or something terrible like that. So it's something that is an immediate emergency before you could release information about it. So what I thought I'd do is try to make things a little bit more real for you guys. We could walk through a hypothetical. This is way more effective in person. So I'm sorry, you're just going to be listening to me talk a little bit about it, because I would try to get answers from you guys, but for some reason, since I can't see the chat, it makes it even more challenging to see what the answers are when I ask you questions in a minute. So forgive me as I just walk through it. So this is an example where you're on your way to class. You see John, who's a star student in your class. And unlike his usual well-kept demeanor, he seems to be disheveled. He smells of alcohol. He's talking to himself. He appears lost. You're concerned. What can you do about that? Who can you report that information to? And so I have a list of folks that ask about. I mean, the categories are sort of folks that are on campus. Would there be a legitimate educational interest? You might be going sort of through that inquiry in your mind. Is there a health and safety emergency? Could I tell his parents? Could I call the police or any of those sort of things? But the answer to this one is sort of a trick question, in that this example that we were looking at was just things that you saw. It's nothing that's actually recorded. So it's not in a note form at the moment. It's just what you saw. So it's not actually a FERPA record, a student education record. So you can tell anybody in the world you want to about this because it's what you saw and observed. In the next part of this same hypothetical, we take it just one step further. And so John's erratic behavior continues. You make notes to yourself in class about his interactions. So we now have a record. And when his class is ending, you've made those notes. What can you do with those notes and who can they be shared with? And so I have sort of that same list of folks to be able to walk through. And the short answer is that you can tell all those folks that sort of are in the top half of this list: the professor, the associate dean, the counseling center, the BAT or the CARES team, because now these are notes that you've taken. They could be not even education records, because they could just be your sole possession notes. But if you share them with anyone, so you decide you want to share them with someone because you're concerned, and so you want to call CARES and share this information with Angel or her team, can you do it? You can, but once you've shared what you've written down, it's not sole possession anymore. It's a student education record, but those folks have a legitimate educational interest, so it's okay to be able to share the information with them. I don't think we're to the point where you would call police or call the parents because you think there's some kind of safety emergency at this point. You're just concerned about sort of his general well-being, but you're not worried about something terrible happening right this minute. So I wouldn't share it with the campus police or John's parents, and certainly wouldn't call the technician up to put it on their list. And so our last part of our hypothetical continues, and now John has sent you an email. So it's also another record. It's a computer record that's come through. He's marked it personal and confidential. Do not share. He's very clear about that. And the list is, sorry for my behavior. I've got a lot going on. I'm just tired of it all. I think it's time to end it. Don't tell anyone. It's been great to know you. Goodbye. Well, this is something that, although, you're not a mandatory reporter, which is for Title IX, I would hope that you would immediately get on the phone and be taking, because as a university, if we have, there are a lot of cases that are out there about our duty to be able to protect our students when they're here. And if we know that a student is in danger and they've made a threat that they might, for instance, be suicidal, or if they were to threaten somebody else in this manner, that we do have a duty to report those things, and you should call up someone immediately. And so from our list, you could really let anybody know on this list, except I wouldn't say the campus newspaper again. I mean, you can call. The legitimate interest certainly applies to the counseling center. If you want to call your professor just to ask the question, well, who should I call first, or share that information about them, you're okay sharing with them, you're okay, letting the counseling center know. But now it sounds like it's an urgent situation, and we need to get health officials out there immediately. And so our campus will go do, police can do a welfare check. They can get ambulances there if that's needed, or check things out. We can even call John's parents at that point, because it's a safety emergency and we think there's an immediate risk at this point. So that's all that I have on FERPA, and I don't, maybe I'll pause for a minute. Vanessa, are there any questions on that piece first before I go into this next section?
I haven't seen any questions. We have had some fluctuating sound, so I've just advised people to turn on their transcript. So at the it's not cutting out, it's just becoming muffled at some points. So I just wanted to let you know that was happening.
Okay, I'll try to be a little bit more clear. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so then the last piece, we're almost out of time too, is really quickly on the interpersonal relationships among faculty, staff, and students. We do have a policy in place that we're trying to ensure the academic integrity of all of our evaluations, to make sure that students are getting fair evaluations in all of their classes. And because relationships where you're in sort of an amorous or a family situation with folks can either be an actual conflict of interest, or at least an appearance of a conflict of interest. We just want to take that away. And so we have a policy in place that prohibits university employees from having any kind of educational responsibility for anybody with whom they have an amorous or familial relationship. And so that policy 042006 does define what those terms are. I mean, an amorous relationship is just two individuals voluntarily engaged in a romantic partnership. So if you're dating, you're engaged, you're sexually intimate, any of those sort of things, you can't have that any kind of educational responsibility for that person. And so you would need to get removed from the class or discontinue that relationship for that period of time. And even if you think you can be the most objective person in the world in it, we want to avoid the appearance that others in the class think that you can't be, or any of those sort of things. We just want to take those questions out. And so same thing with family relationships. And family is defined in that policy as, a husband or wife, a domestic partner, a parent or child, a brother or sister, grandparent, grandchild, uncle, aunt, niece, cousins. I mean, it's anyone that you would generally consider to be in your family, and it would make sense. It also can be, stepbrothers, half brothers, all that sort of stuff, or in-law relationships. And it always continues throughout the duration of the relationship. So even after, there's a divorce, if there's any sort of appearance that there might still be some kind of impartiality, then they're going to still advise you to keep this separate from that. So those are all the topics that I have for you guys today. Are anything else? Any questions? Oops, sorry. I don't know how to stop sharing. Here we go.
Usually there are some kind of terrified questions at this point. So please don't hesitate to ask. I mean, I know this is legal information. Sometimes students who are TAing for the first time get very nervous about this. One of our panelists has a question. This is great. Isaac is asking, is there anything formally prohibiting your ability to teach someone you consider a close friend, but not a romantic or familial relationship?
Not that I'm aware of, but I will say that I'm the student liaison usually. And so my colleague, Sarah Lanham, is the one that handles our employment type issues, but I don't think there's anything that prohibits that. Now, it doesn't mean that it's a great idea and that maybe you shouldn't raise that and see if the person could be moved to a different section. And Peter may have other thoughts on that as well.
Just to chime in on that, I think, even faculty have friendships among some of the students and still teach them. So, it's just part of life. I think you need to be sure that you're being as objective as you can and that you're treating everyone fairly. I mean, that's ultimately where issues could arise. And so I just think, to a certain degree, use common sense in terms of how you interact with those folks.
Also,
because students are because students in many cases, especially, and what I found when I was a TA, especially those students who want to go on to grad school and so on, they sort of gravitate towards you as someone who has more information about a place where they want to be. And I think, getting back to what April was talking about, you're making these connections to people that are super important. Did you want to add something, Vanessa?
I just wanted to say there are a couple more questions in the chat. I don't know, Betsy, if you can see them now or if your chat is still hidden.
I see the one, what if the TA and student were in an amorous relationship prior to attending the university, but they're not, but the TA is not teaching the student? As long as you don't have educational responsibility for them, it's fine. Oh, and I guess I should have mentioned when we were on that page too, it also, that policy that we were talking about does prevent you from engaging in any sexual activity at all with a minor who's enrolled at NC State. So if you have someone that's even if you don't have educational responsibility for them, if you are a university employee, we prohibit you from having sex with anyone under the age of 18 under this policy. So only if there's an age limit in your hypothetical there. And so then I also see the question from Katie about an example of a TA that broke a FERPA rule and what the consequence was. I don't have any particular examples off the top of my head, but I will tell you that FERPA doesn't give students a private right of action to sue us for a FERPA violation, but they can report it to OCR, which is the federal agency that kind of looks into it and talk through it. And if the agency thinks that there's an issue and that we are repeatedly violating FERPA or are not paying attention to the federal law, they can take away federal funding, which is a huge deal. So because I don't deal with the employment side of the issues as much in my department, I'm afraid I don't know exactly what the level of different consequences might be about how the university would deal with an infraction of violating our policy. Maybe Peter, you can share better on that. I don't know, put you on the spot. I don't actually know the answer to that.
I mean, I'll be honest, I haven't seen it happen or have people be accused of that. I mean, I just haven't run into it yet. So I think it's good to be forewarned by Betsy in terms of what to avoid so you don't get in a situation. But I think in most cases, people respect that privacy.
I think that's true. And I see another question. If we have questions about FERPA or other laws or any of the topics that came up from here, you're welcome to reach out to our office, the Office of General Counsel. We're in Holiday Hall. You can give us a buzz. I don't actually know what the general number is, but I'm sure you can Google the Office of General Counsel and it'll come up with our general number to be able to, and they'll direct you to the right person who could be able to answer your particular question. We represent the university as a whole. So if your question is, just a normal legal question about you in particular that doesn't have to do with your role at NC State, we can't help you with that, but we can help you with anything that has to do with legal issues here for the university.
And I will add on the personal front, there's actually, your student fees pay for legal advice. And you can take advantage of that person on campus if they're not in the general counsel's office.
Student legal services is a different unit from our office altogether. What else did I miss in there? Is information shared within cultural centers considered protected student information? That's all those cultural centers are part of the university. So that is part of our public business and they are public records unless they're about a particular student and then they're protected by FERPA. But in general, they would be public records. So be careful what you put in your emails. We used to say you don't want it to be a headline in the New York Times, but now I guess it would be, you don't want it to appear in whatever the latest social media app is of choice.
I think we need to move on. Thank you so much, Betsy, as always, for plying us with your legal insights. And at this point, we're going to pivot to a student panel and Vanessa will take over moderating, but I do want to thank the 4 students who are taking part: Latasha Williams, Javier Hueta, Irina Randria Miadana, and Isaac Sunseri, a number of whom have taken an active part and are preparing the professoriate program. So let me turn it over to you, Vanessa. And it's often good to hear from people who are actually in your shoes in terms of how they deal with things. So take it away, Vanessa.
Thank you so much, Peter. We really, really appreciate you being here.
It's a pleasure to do this. Teaching is so important that I wouldn't miss it. So be well, everybody, and enjoy the classroom because it really can be fun.
See you later, Peter. And welcome to our panelists. Yes, these are people that Peter and I know pretty well, or at least I know pretty well if he doesn't, but who have been through PTP with us, who have been through teaching and communication certificate programming with us. And I can vouch for their experience and their high level of skill in the classroom. Also, they've been in your shoes really recently. They're still TAing at NC State. So without further ado, what I would like to see happen is to have them very briefly introduce themselves and say anything they want to immediately get off their chest very briefly. We already have a question from the audience that was asked at the end of the last presentation, but I think would be really appropriate for the 4 of you. So I am going to mute myself. Let's go in this order. Sometimes it helps for me to set the order. We'll go with Latasha, Isaac, Javier, and then Irina, because that's the order in which you appear on my screen.
Thank you. So good morning. I'm Latasha. I am a 5th year PhD candidate and hopefully have at this point had my last TA experience, but I have taught online asynchronous classes or been the TA for and professor of record for 3 years, 4 years. And I think probably, I don't know if it's something to get off my chest, but some advice to share from my time just being a graduate student is when it comes to teaching and communication is definitely make sure like all the resources that have been presented this morning, that you take advantage of those and know that they're out there and know that there's somebody that can help you. And taking the teaching and communication classes that are not part of your curriculum actually gets you outside of your department and helps you to improve your teaching when it comes to not just what you're teaching, but how you're teaching what you're teaching. And so that is my advice. Take advantage of the resources and meet people outside of your department.
Hi, everyone. My name is Isaac Sinceri. I'm also a fifth-year PhD candidate in the mathematics department. I have, I think, 3 years of teaching experience as a recitation leader and or instructor of record for several classes. I'm also part of the Teaching and Communication Certificate and PTP programs, which I really highly recommend to anybody interested in teaching, just improving your teaching while you're here at NC State, or if you want to pursue a teaching related sort of position after you graduate. And if you have other questions about that, I don't know if Vanessa has already talked about them this morning, but I'm sure that we can answer more questions about that because they're really great programs. A few pieces of advice I would give you. I am assuming that probably a lot of the TAs in this workshop are going to be new TAs. And so you might be kind of freaking out a little bit about your first time TAing. And I would just encourage you that it's okay if you don't know everything. You can't possibly be prepared for every question a student could possibly ask you. And it's totally fine. I've done this many times. If somebody asks you a question that catches you off guard and you don't know, just say, I don't know the answer to that right now. I will figure it out and I will let you know tomorrow or during the next class. And then actually follow up with that answer next class, because that's going to build a kind of trusting relationship that they know that even if you don't know it right now, you are going to do some extra homework outside of class and you want them to learn and you want to help them along. So I think that's just good to know that you don't need to know everything right away. And then the other piece of advice I would give is to seek out mentorship experiences and just people who can observe you and give you feedback. That's probably the thing that has helped me improve my teaching the most, is having several mentors who have sort of observed some of my classes, and then I would meet with them afterwards and they would give me some feedback about, I think you can improve on this, or I think this is really well and this works well. And so anytime you can get feedback from student evaluations, or especially from a mentor who's going to observe you and be able to give you advice, I think is just a really, really valuable experience.
Hi everyone, my name is Javier. I'm a fifth-year PhD student at the Chemical and Biomolecular Engineering program. Well, I think Latasha and Isaac already said a good bunch of the advice that I could also mention. But on top of that, I just want to repeat that if you really want, are interested in education and being good PAs, yes, consider joining the workshops that are part of the Teaching and Communication program and also the PTP program. They really help me a lot to improve as a TA, and also because I would like to eventually be a professor, so that is very helpful. And the other thing that I will tell you is consider time management is very important, because you are TAs, but you are also grad students, right? So that was probably the thing that cost me a little bit to figure out when I just started, because you, unlike the students that are only grad students and not TAing, you have sort of double the workload. But to overcome this, consider that you can always talk with your instructor, with other TAs. They are your literal allies. They have been through this, and they can give you valuable advice about what to do and how to manage the workload.
Thank you. And I didn't necessarily intend for this to become an infomercial for the programs that we run, but that's fantastic. I mean, I'm glad to hear that they've been helpful and we can talk about them more. I'm actually not seeing Irina. Irina, if you're here, please raise your hand and make yourself known, because sometimes Zoom eats people's names and turns them into something different. But I think we should start by answering Edgar's question. Any advice on interacting with students that are more so your peers? Oh my goodness, we've all dealt with this, right? For example, you're a second year grad student TAing a class for another grad student or for other grad students. It seems like the dynamic is a fine balancing of, I've taken this class, I'm knowledgeable, but you're obviously just as capable as I am. And I would add also in general, when you're close in age or experience to your students, how do you navigate that effectively?
If I may, so I haven't been a TA for a grad level course, but I've been on the other side. I can tell you that what really worked for me as a student, like I remember how these TAs did it, was literally doing that, treating me like you already know this, so I'm just going to guide you in something that you already know, like you already have the idea, but if I'm going to ask the TA is because I just want to be sure that what I'm doing or my plan to approach this is correct. So they are clear that they understand that, and they are more guides, right, than proper teachers, let's say. Yeah, so that's what worked for me as a student, and I really appreciate that they were more about, okay, you already know this, just show me what you want to do, and I'll tell you how you can improve it.
I would say, and again, not to be an infomercial for the graduate school, but it's like one of my favorite things about NC State. But I would say, you know, one of the things that I've learned through taking some of the workshops is that everybody has different learning styles and everybody's going to be kind of in different places. I haven't taught graduate students, but I have done undergraduate. But from what I can tell from my experiences of trying to teach people in other majors or even in my major about, and I'm in nutrition, sorry, I forgot to mention that, because everybody knows about eating, right? But to try to cater to different learning styles, I think we heard that this morning, and trying to communicate that it's not necessarily always about knowing everything or knowing as much as the next person, but communicating well, you know, and even, you know, having them to help other students who may not know as much as, you know, they do. And so that it doesn't become a battle, I guess, between the TA and the student of, you know, in class, you know, who knows more than who. And that, I guess that comes to mind. I can't remember who it was this morning that showed the student that was ready to be argumentative. You don't want to create that situation. So, you know, just recognizing that there are going to be people who may have read a couple more books than you, or like Isaac said, you're not going to know everything. And it's always good that when somebody presents something that you don't know, to say, well, that's good to know. Maybe we should, you know, tell us a little bit more about that. So I find that, you know, working on your communication versus working on knowing more than the other person is probably a little bit more effective.
So I just recently in the spring taught a sort of senior level undergraduate class where I was probably only maybe a few years older than a lot of the students in there. But I didn't really get the sense from the students that they like didn't respect me as a teacher or anything like that. I think undergrads generally view graduate students as like, you're almost a professor. Like, you're not technically a professor, but I think a lot of undergrads still view graduate students as like, you're more experienced than I am. So I don't think you would get a lot of trouble, especially if you're just teaching undergrads, with any kind of relationship like that. With graduate students, if you're a TA for a graduate class, generally you're just going to be like a grader or something. Probably you're probably not going to be the instructor of record. So like Javier said, you're more of a guide, just if they need extra help and you're grading their assignments and things like that. I have on occasion kind of stepped in when my advisor was out of town and taught like one lecture of his graduate class, and he gave me his notes. And in that kind of case where you are actually teaching the class, there is kind of an understood relationship with the other graduate students, at least in the one that I taught, that was like, I just took this class last year and you all are just as capable as I am. And I'm, you know, teaching you this information, but we're really all on the same playing field. If you have a question that I don't know how to answer, like that's totally fine. The regular professor is going to be back tomorrow. And so, yeah, I haven't had a whole lot of difficulty with anything like that.
Yeah, and I think going back, I think it was Latasha who kind of got at the point that when you're in a position of authority, well, you all kind of hinted at this. When you're in a position of authority relative to other people, you are in a position of authority. And so there's a certain amount of respect for that, I think. And nobody is at exactly the same place. I mean, I think that's absolutely true. I am not a member of the panel. I need to stop panelizing and just moderate. I think Stephanie has a great follow-up question to this. Have there been any problems with disrespect toward TAs, whether in a lab setting or in a classroom setting, based on gender, age, or other characteristics? Have you experienced that? Have you seen that? How? And I'm going to ask the implied question. How do you deal with that?
I haven't personally. I feel like our department's pretty good about respecting what people have to say. But I have, again, just looking outside to other departments when I've interacted, seen some people feel that way. And it goes back to, you know, helping them to make the referrals to the, or helping them to see the options on campus that are there to help them. I think, and I don't want to get the offices all mixed up, but there are several offices on campus that help with like mediating and, you know, help with, I think, like I said, I don't want to get the offices mixed up, but there are places on campus that you can go to get help if you're feeling that way, that can advise you and guide you on what your next step should be if you're feeling that way.
Does anyone else want to address that, or are we good?
Yeah, I'll just input that. I also haven't had any problems with disrespect. But let's see. The first time I was an instructor of record, I was probably only 2 years older than some of the students in that class. It was a class of like 115 in a Calculus 2 class. And I was probably barely older than some of the students in there, and I didn't have any problems with disrespect or anything like that. I got some comments that said that I looked really young, but otherwise nobody really mentioned anything about like the age discrepancy or like he's not old enough to teach us. So I haven't had any problems with anything like that.
Yeah, just to say that a similar situation, I haven't seen that. When I had to, I mean, when in all my interactions, all the students were very respectful. I mean, they really want your help. So everyone is there to help each other, honestly.
So I'm not skipping your question, Scarlett. I see your question, but staying kind of in the same line of how to overcome potential differences in communication. How would you work either as an international TA or working with international students or students who don't necessarily come from the same language background? How do you kind of navigate communication in that setting?
Well, specifically about the accent, I have a friend from my same department. He graduated almost like 4 years ago, and he was a winner of the 3-minute thesis contest. I don't know if you know about this. Probably I'm just going to mention it eventually. But it's a really nice contest for people who homing your presentation skills. But anyway, so he was also from a Latin American background. And he won this presentation contest at the university level, and I asked him, so what recommendation you gave him, because I was in my first year, and he told me, don't lose the accent. That gives you more personality, like that makes you more recognizable. And I really appreciate that he said that. Honestly, when I was the first time that I had to give a class, I was very self-conscious about the accent. But everyone was very helpful, and if they had and if at any moment I said something that wasn't that clear, they were very respectful about asking, could you repeat this, could you repeat that? Yeah, so once again, people are respectful about these differences, these cultural differences, and I really appreciate that help navigate these issues.
Okay. So I do want to address Scarlett's question, which is what resources have helped you to avoid burnout? I'm so sorry. I will stare at you until you answer, right?
Maybe, Natasha, go ahead. I already talked. Oh, okay. So
well, I was just gonna make a joke and say, don't you see the flames coming out of my head right now? I don't know if I have a list of resources, but I think again, not to, put another plug in for the graduate school, but just getting out of my own head sometimes helps. And the way that I do that and continue to be what I would call productive, I think I read the other day, it's called workcrastination, is that I will do something that doesn't have anything to do with teaching or whatever, whether it's one of the writing courses or something along those lines. And then just to relax, honestly, I like to take a lot of naps with my dog. That seems to help a lot. And I podcast a lot. And there's actually one of my favorite podcasts is Hello PhD. And it's these two guys from that other university down there with the light blue, but it's a pretty good podcast. And if you're in a PhD, I think they say it's like for people who are in a PhD program or love people who are in a PhD program, but it's very helpful. So that's kind of how I decompress.
I think it's very important, not only as a TA, but as a graduate student to have your own personal life and take care of it as much as you take care of your studies. I remember my first year, I was really burned out because the first year, at least in my department, they try to put a lot of work on you to kickstart you very fast and send you to do the research. It was actually during my second year that I made the group of friends that I have until now. And well, before COVID, we used to travel a lot and have a lot of activities. So basically that, having as you have a routine about doing your research, doing the teaching classes, etc., but also try to have at least some sort of routine for your personal life, playing some sports, going out, even having a hike, that helps a lot. And if even that is not enough, you can always go to the health services, the student health services. They have really good therapies. I haven't used the services, but I know I have friends that have used them and have really good experiences with that.
And so like Javier and Latasha said, it's important to have a personal life. And yeah, I agree with that. In sort of a different direction, something that I have found helpful, I think Latasha also touched on this, is again, going back to the teaching and communication certificate and the PTP and just the different workshops that the graduate school offers, and maybe your department would offer some as well. I think it can be helpful to do workshops and things like that because it helps you work on improving your teaching and just staying engaged, so that rather than just sort of going through the motions and getting burned out, like, oh, I'm just making lesson plan after lesson plan and I'm grading a test and just sort of going through all the motions. If you're doing something to actively try to get better and actively try to like learn more and going to a workshop and something like that, it can make teaching feel more exciting and more engaging. At least for me, it does. So whenever I am doing things like that, it makes me feel more excited and more engaged about what I'm doing. Yeah.
And I will say, just from our experience on the professional development team, one thing we really love to see is how people form communities outside of their department, outside of their program. Your department, your program is really, really important. And I'm not trying to minimize that. But when I see how people work together on these sort of interdisciplinary or common problems around teaching, learning, writing, public speaking, career search and development, it's really cool to see the friendships that form because they're inherently, I think, less competitive. You're not looking at the same jobs. You're not pursuing similar paths. You're not trying to interview at the same places, right? So you can actually disengage from that competitive side of academia.
Vanessa, so can I briefly just talk about the TCC and PTP, just because we've mentioned them so many times, but I don't think we've really like talked about what they are.
Please do.
So for anybody interested in what we've been talking about, so the Teaching and Communication Certificate so the graduate school offers a lot of workshops to help you improve various aspects of your teaching and things like that. And the Teaching and Communication Certificate is a way to sort of recognize that. And so I think you need 100 hours worth of kind of workshops and other kind of teaching related activities to get the Teaching and Communication Certificate. And so that's kind of a very broad sense of what that is. And it's just a good way to acknowledge that I've done a lot of professional development in this area of teaching and communication. And then PTP, Preparing the Professoriate, is a really good program if you're interested in pursuing a job in academia when you're done with your graduate program. If you want to be a professor, the Preparing the Professoriate is really preparing you for that. So it will help you with writing things like your teaching statements and your research statements and things like that. It will help you figure out, how to apply to jobs and what kind of things to look for. And so that's a really good program as well. It also will, at least for me, it helps me with my teaching a little bit as well, but it's really geared towards helping people prepare for becoming a professor.
No, just to add to what Isaac said, we always talk about the PCC and the PTP, but don't forget also the A2I for people who are more focused on industry. There is a sort of an equivalent, the Acceleration to Industry program. I have a friend who went there and had an extremely, really good experience in there. That's just to put it out there.
And I am frantically putting all of these in the chat. So they have been spelled out at some point in the chat. You'll notice that we absolutely love to use 3-letter tags on our Go links. So Accelerate to Industry, A2I, Teaching and Communication Certificate, TCC, Preparing the Professoriate, PTP, 3-minute Thesis, 3MT, and today brought to you by TAW, the new TA workshop. So we try to make them very short and digestible for our own sanity and for everyone else's. So there's a question about time management. How do you balance teaching, research, and other responsibilities?
Well, I am if I write things down, they'll get done. If I don't write them down, I don't know, they kind of go into the ether. So one of the things that I tend to do, and I have to do this periodically, especially now in the dissertation writing phase, because I can definitely let time get away from me, is that every now and then I have to do for myself what do you call it? My brain's blanking right now, but where you evaluate how you're spending your time. So sometimes I kind of do it in reverse, where instead of me writing down all the things that I hope to do that day, I actually write down what I do that day to see how I'm spending my time. If I start to feel like, my productivity is going down, or that I don't feel like I'm doing as much as I want to be doing, I will do kind of like I said, I'll write down how I'm spending my time just to see where my time's going. And if I'm spending too much time on, TA things, or, too much time sitting in front of my computer trying to write a sentence, then I kind of readjust. And that's how I figure out where my time is going. So that's usually my first step. And then from there, and it's crazy that this works for me. But then from there, I write down the things that I want to make sure that I work on every day. And I kind of give myself points. I don't know why it works for me. I give myself points for the things that I work on, and it makes me feel better. And it makes me, and I can see my progress when I do that. If I give myself points for, okay, you know, I worked on this for 30 minutes today, then I'll give myself some points for that. And I don't know what the points add up to, maybe a nap later. I haven't figured out yet, but it just makes me feel like I'm moving forward. So.
Yeah, I think I do something similar to what Latasha does usually is I actually have a notebook here that I've had since I started graduate school that I take notes for all of my meetings with my advisor in, and it's almost full. So I'm afraid that it's not going to quite make it to the end of my program. But what I usually do is each week I will write down kind of a line for each day. So Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and then I'll write down kind of bullet points for what I want to accomplish each day of the week. And then, you know, as that day goes by, I'll cross out that thing if I did it, or I'll move it to another day if I didn't get it done. And that helps me see I take things week by week usually. And that helps me see that, you know, I've got a good balance of I have time scheduled for research this week, and I also have time scheduled for doing my teaching stuff. So if I know Tuesday, I'm going to be grading a test all day, and then maybe on Wednesday and Thursday, I'll focus on research instead. So that helps me, looking at the whole week, helps me sort of keep a balance of, I know some days I'm going to be more focused on this, and some days I'll be more focused on that. And then when it comes to sort of personal life, what helps me is I've tried my best throughout graduate school to kind of keep my weekends as sacred as possible for personal life. So generally, like, you always have more to do. You can always be doing work, you know, there's always more research to do that you could fill your weekends with. But I generally just take the mindset that, like, it's fine if it waits for 2 days until Monday. So unless there's a pressing deadline that I need to hit before the end of this weekend, it will wait till next week. So my weekends generally are just completely reserved for having time off. And that's something that really helps me as well with not burning out.
And I see that some people are mentioning some task management tools in the chat. My own recommendation is Trello. I found it very helpful, to the point that I even put my personal stuff in there. So I have I put all the work-related stuff and also my personal stuff, so I can keep track also that I have to go out with friends or they go see a movie, etc. And it is very easy to customize. I have color codes for everything that means, oh, this color code means I have to do this today or this week, or I have only 1 month to do this. So yeah, eventually you will customize it, and it is really helpful to keep track of things that you need to do.
I think what I'm hearing here as the overarching theme is that you have to find the system that works for you, and you have to be willing to change it if it's not working anymore. And sometimes different things will work better than others. Another thing I'm hearing is that the three of you are like the most instructor-ish of instructors I've ever heard. Latasha's grading herself. Javier is color coding all of his tasks. Isaac, I believe you're scheduling your personal time too, and you have a single notebook for an entire graduate school curriculum. I mean, this is awesome. And also, I mean, I think it's the level of organization that probably serves you well in the classroom too. I know that we are at time. It just feels like this session flies by. But I want to thank the three of you so much. It's always just delightful to see our wonderful, experienced and talented and skilled instructors coming back. And I know everyone on the call has spent 3 very intense hours. You do have a break until 1. Please let me encourage you to take advantage of our breakout sessions this afternoon. We're not able to record them. They are led by individual instructors, partners from across our wonderful institution. So choose the one in each session that makes the most sense for you right now, and know that, you know, you can get further training on any of these topics. All of the training that we've mentioned to you today is absolutely free, and you're eligible for it as a graduate student or postdoc. So I know this is like drinking out of the fire hose of information. If you want to explore any of these topics in more depth, there's a way to do it on this campus. And there's very likely a way to do it for free. So don't hesitate to reach out to the people that you've met this morning or to me. I want to thank my colleagues, Stella Jackman Ryan, who you've also received a ton of emails from, who is my right-hand person, absolutely, in all things New Teaching Workshop related. And I want to thank my colleague, Joe Aldinger, who runs A2I and today is running our YouTube live stream. Stella has an assist from her smallest child. I love it. So just thank you all so much. Thank you for your engagement. And I hope you have a wonderful afternoon. Please stay connected to each other on Whova as well. I've seen some fun things happening there in terms of community building. So thanks again to our panelists. Thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of your day. And hopefully I'll hear from you or see you again soon.